Today I'm speaking with Anna Schroeder. Anna, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's all right. Hi.
And I appreciate you doing this because we had to juggle our schedules because you are all the way on the other side of the planet. Where are you located, by the way?
I'm in New Zealand,
And
in the South Island specifically.
is it Christchurch?
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Gotcha. I have never been there, but obviously because of the Lord of the Rings, we
Yeah.
love your country and for other reasons too. But what is it like living there?
It's pretty great, to be honest. I mean, no country's perfect, but I feel like New Zealand's it's a pretty great country to be. It's like it's not too crowded. There are lots of like I'm in a city, but there's not lots of nice walks we can go on, lots of hill walks and bush walks, and yeah, it's just a really nice place to live.
Hmm. And how is the country doing with COVID and all that these days?
It was doing really well, but we've had a few cases up in the North Island of the Delta variant. So we had to have a wee lockdown for a little while, and they're still, I think, having a bit of a lockdown up north. Yeah, but otherwise we're actually doing okay. I think the vaccine rollout has been a little bit slow. So I've only just had my first vaccination. So yeah, we're doing okay.
Gotcha.
Better than a lot of places, I guess.
Yeah, it's good to hear that. And in terms of your bio, you're also a stay-at-home mom to 3 kids, aged 9, 7, and 4. So you and I can relate on how busy the home can be there. And your background is in preschool education. And I've also read that you like to read a lot, both fiction and nonfiction, and you're also a runner and you enjoy doing yoga at home, which is awesome. Do your kids do yoga with you?
Sometimes, yeah. I mean, I try to do it when they're not around because they sort of interrupt me quite a lot, and it's supposed to be like a real calm, relaxing, meditative time. But yeah, sometimes they do, join in, and they love it too.
That's
so that's
awesome.
really good. Yeah.
And is there anything else you could tell us about yourself? Any other hobbies or fun points of interest about you?
I really like doing puzzles, like jigsaw puzzles.
Okay.
So I have a puzzle board that I get out because we can't obviously leave a 1,000-piece puzzle lying around because it will get destroyed. So I bring that out in the evening sometimes, and I'll watch like some TV and do a puzzle. I also like watching TV shows like on Netflix. I think that's pretty much me. Yeah, and as you said, I do like to run as well. So I try and get out sort of 3 times a week to do that. It's relaxing. It's good for your mental health and obviously physical health. Yeah.
That's awesome. It's a good convicting thing for me too, because I need to be doing a lot more of that. Time is short sometimes, but it's one of those things where you got to make time for your health. Well,
yeah, you do.
I definitely look forward to hearing your story today because your story is a little bit different than most. I don't know too many details, but I know enough to know that your journey is a little bit unique. Obviously unique in the sense that you're in New Zealand compared to most people that I talk to are in the US and a few in the UK. But your story is very unique, and so I'm looking forward to hearing the details of it. And is it correct to say that it's your story starts with an actual cult, even though I call any version of Christianity a cult. You were in a subsection of Christianity that even Christians would have called a cult, right? Gotcha. Well,
yeah, definitely.
If you're good, then take us away. Let's hear where you're coming from.
Okay. So I spent the first of 6 to 7 years of my life in a cult. I'll have to go a little bit back and give you a wee bit more detail. So my dad was born into a Christian home, and my granddad, once he got back from the war, he actually helped to build this church because I think before that it was just a group of people meeting in a house, and they decided they needed somewhere to go to have their church and to grow their church. And so my granddad helped build the building, which is still standing and still a church now. And that's sort of in the centre of Christchurch a little bit more. And so my dad obviously joined, because he had no choice. But I guess it didn't really start out as a cult. It started out as a church. And sort of from there, the person who was in charge of this church, he decided that it sort of wasn't enough. I think the church wasn't enough, and it just sort of snowballed from there, I guess. So he started to enforce various different rules on the congregation. rules such as like what you were allowed to wear. So that was really strict. The men could only wear long sleeves or long pants, and the woman could only wear long skirts or dresses with long sleeves and, like high necks. And to church, we had to wear hats. All the women had to wear hats, and the girls had to wear hats as well. So I have all these photos of me looking ridiculous in this white hat. And yeah, so I'll just go over some of the other rules. They had rules about hairstyles. You were only allowed a certain hairstyle for men as well as women. You had to have, if you're a woman, you had to have long hair, and you had to wear it in sort of a bun, so it was sort of up and away and away from your face. So I tend to wear my hair down a lot because of that. But anyway, yeah. So
can I ask you a little bit about that?
Yes. Sure, yeah.
With these rules, and I know you said you were young, so some of this may not be something you can speak to, but do you remember if they were giving like rationales for it? And I'm just guessing because I went to a conservative school here. I don't think you would have heard of it in New Zealand, but it was called Bob Jones University. But they had some rules that would have, at least back a generation ago for sure, they would have sounded very similar. And I know that their rationale for it was that you needed to look different in the world. You needed to look, and you also needed to, when you're coming to church, you need to be bringing your very best to the Lord. Was it like that, or do you think there were other rationales for their motivations?
Yeah, I think that was definitely part of it. They're wanting to look different to the rest of the world, but then also the leader was stuck in the 50s. So his sort of whole thing was that he wanted his church to, and the people of the congregation to sort of be like, the 40s or the 50s. And that's sort of how everybody looked. But I mean, to the extreme, like, everything had to be covered. And then of course there's the whole modesty issue, not wanting to show any skin because that's, bad or wrong. And I think also some Bible verses that talk about head coverings, like women having head coverings. So yeah, I think that's where that came from. And also going a little bit deeper, I think it's also about the control. He, in the end, or towards the end of this cult, he wanted to have control in every single area of our lives. And I guess it wasn't just him. It was also the elders of the church. Yeah.
When you looked at that as a kid, do you remember thinking at all at that time, even at a young age, that it was weird, or was it just like everyone's doing it, so it's just totally normal?
Oh, I have some quite specific memories of having to wear long dresses. I didn't like wearing dresses or skirts. I always wanted to wear pants, and I saw other people wearing pants. And so I would try and put my blouses on my legs, like, my legs through the arms of my shirts and blouses, so that I could pretend to wear pants. And after a few times of doing that, Mum had to say, look, I'm sorry, but you can't do that anymore, which I wasn't particularly happy about. I also remember a very specific memory of seeing a girl across the road, and she would have been, young. I would have been 4 or 5. She was probably about the same age, and she was wearing pants. And my immediate thought was, this girl is going to hell because she's wearing pants. And for a 4 or 5-year-old child to think that is like, it's horrific, And that's one of the memories that I still have.
That is so classic though, because that's exactly what I think it does. It leads people to feel like that, like if you're different. I think for me, I would have said something like that about long hair on guys,
sure,
or short hair, really short hair on women. Yeah, I would have said it, or maybe not that they're going to hell, but there's a really serious question here. Their spirituality is very much in doubt. Yeah, it's interesting how that gets so easily connected.
Yeah. Oh, it so absolutely does. Yeah.
You mentioned the something about the phrase the cult, while it lasted. Most cults, that I was familiar with, such as we would have called the Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons cults, and certainly some of the other stranger ones, the David Koresh kind of stuff. But like when you say it was ending, was it just a short period of time, and how did your family's time in that work?
So my mum joined the cult when she was, I think, a late teen. She was going out with a guy at the time, and they were sort of looking for a church to go to, and they discovered this one. And of course, everyone there was really welcoming and really trying hard to, get them to stay, and which they obviously did. And so they had to stop living together because they were living together at the time, and they also had to go into what they called like a sister house or a brother house. So the men would go into a house with lots of other men, single men. So these were usually men in their late teens, early 20s, before they got married. And so they would live in a house together, sometimes with an older unmarried man, sometimes with a married couple. And then the woman would go into these sister houses where there would be several, unmarried women living there, sometimes with an older woman who was sort of overseeing things, making sure everyone was doing what they were supposed to be doing. And so, my mum went to live in one of those houses, and my dad, I think once he turned 18, he had to, or might have even been younger than that, he had to leave his family home. And one thing Dad said to me was, because I asked my parents some of their memories, Dad said that he wasn't allowed to go on holidays with his family anymore, which he found really hard. He had to go on holidays with these men from the house that he was living with at the time. And also, they often didn't have their own rooms, so they often had to share a bedroom, generally quite a small bedroom, with, someone else in the house. And that's what they would do. And their entertainment was, for the woman, it was knitting and reading the Bible and maybe singing with a guitar. We weren't allowed TV or radio or newspapers or anything like that. We were allowed the Bible and a book called Pilgrim's Progress. You may have heard of that.
Yeah, John Bunyan.
Yep. And I remember when I was about 6 getting Little Pilgrim's Progress, which I still have. And so that was all they were allowed to do. And I think for the men, they were allowed to go for walks and possibly go swimming when they went on holiday. Other than, I'm not sure if there was anything else. It was really restrictive, really restrictive on what they could do.
When you said they lived in the houses, was this like a compound or just houses in communities that they
No.
had purchased, or?
So it wasn't a compound. So there was this one specific area of town that you were allowed to live in.
Okay.
And so most of the church members lived in this specific area, and there were all these sort of different houses. The church owned, I think, a few of the houses, and then other members of the congregation owned these houses that people would live in.
That's your description, and I want to hear a little bit more about it. But just so far, it's amazing the just the nitty gritty details that they want to manipulate.
I barely started. There were so many rules.
Take us in. Tell us more, because this is very interesting.
Yeah, well, just going back to the not being allowed books. So my mum is an avid reader as well. She absolutely loves reading, and she wasn't allowed to read, books other than that. So I can't even imagine how hard that would have been for her.
What would have happened if they found her with a book that was banned? Say she's just reading a secular book or even a Christian book that was liberal from their perspective. What would have happened to her?
Well, it depends on where in the timeline. If it was earlier, she would have gotten a very stern telling off and possibly been called into a meeting with the elders and been sat down for several hours, and they would have basically preached at her. This actually happened to my dad for something that he did. He missed a church meeting, and he was reprimanded quite harshly for that. There was also another case of, I think he had his hair slightly too long, and he also got reprimanded for that as well. Yeah.
Did the cult have a name, or did they just call themselves a regular Bible church or something?
No, it was called the Evangelistic Church of Christ.
The Evangelistic Church of Christ. I don't think I've ever heard of that before.
No, you wouldn't have. It was very small.
Do you have any idea how big it got at its peak?
maybe 200 members. I'm not 100% sure on that.
Gotcha.
Give or take. Yeah.
With the long dresses, the whole modesty culture stuff, did you ever hear of, and along with that, some of the other dynamics that you're talking about made me wonder about this, but a lot of times in those cults, you'll kind of hear the message from the pulpit of we're wanting to be very pure, wanting to be ultra careful with our bodies to glorify God. But then as time progresses, a lot of times with those kind of groups, you end up hearing some stories of things that happened behind the scenes that were very, very inappropriate. And did you get any sense that some of the bad stuff was going on, or was it like we're preaching holiness and purity, and they were actually, from what you could tell, actually living it? They were really trying to be super careful with sexuality.
Yeah, from what I could tell, I mean, because I was quite young, but even looking back now, I think they were being quite careful. I don't feel like there was any, and I mean, I could be wrong, but I've talked to my parents about this quite a bit, and they have not mentioned any, stuff going on behind the scenes.
That's good.
It
seems like there's so many stories like that coming out these days between the Catholic Church and certainly in the U.S., the Southern Baptist Church and other churches. It's like it's everywhere. Every rock you uncover, there's something bad going on. Well, what with all that strictness, so you were born into it. So what kind of rules did they have for kids, and how did your life look as a kid growing up there?
Well, I was, I guess, quite sort of protected. Like we were in our family. I've got 3 younger sisters as well, so we, spent our time at home. Mum wasn't allowed to work, so she was at home with us all the time. Actually, also, just an interesting little story. When you're pregnant and you're a woman, obviously, you're pregnant, you're not allowed to be seen when you're pregnant. So no one is allowed to see you. So even like walking to the letterbox, if you're seen, you will get reprimanded. So Mum told me that she used to go to like across the other side of town to the supermarket so that she could do her, grocery shopping while she was pregnant without being seen by anyone.
Do you know what the rationale was for that?
No, I don't. Possibly something about women being unclean when they're pregnant. From
the Old Testament rules.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Sorry, we're jumping around a little bit here, but
sure.
The cult sort of at various stages, they believed in the Old Testament, and then they'd go through a phase where they believed in the New Testament like more. Does that make sense? So they sort of went through various phases of what they believed in. I guess somebody would discover a Bible verse from like over here, and then they'd say, okay, we have to sort of change, what we're doing and what we believe a little bit to sort of make this line up, and and then backtrack and make this line up. Yeah, so
that must be a weird dynamic for the congregation in the sense, because I mean, obviously you're looking at it retrospectively from this point in time, but when you're in it, it would seem like it's almost like you're following someone else's spiritual journey, and maybe God didn't convict you to have this perspective on that topic or this topic, or to favor the Old Testament or the New, but because your leader is kind of, that's their journey, they're kind of carrying everyone with them. And it's such an interesting perspective to let, I mean, whether specifically in that cult or just in general in life, to let someone else's spiritual journey so dramatically dictate ours. And obviously as people who are Christians but who've escaped Christianity, we would say that we were doing the same thing with the bad men who wrote the original scriptures, as obviously many men over many centuries, but these ancient men from the Bronze Age and so forth, and Iron Age and all that, these men are dictating our lives today. And their journey from 2,000 years ago is dictating what we do today. But it's like it's the same thing. It's just more condensed in time. Like what this man discovered last week is what we're going to do as a church this week. It's such a weird dynamic.
So weird. Yeah. So for me, for what my life looked like as a child, I think when I was about 3 or 4, we went to like a creche, sort of like a kindergarten situation, but it was run out of somebody's home. in the church, and it was actually attached to the school that we ended up going to. So my dad and his brothers and many other young men at the time, they helped build the school that the I guess the cult sort of commissioned them to build the school. They didn't get paid for it. Dad said that he spent every Saturday from the time he was 15 to the time the school was built, so several years, I guess, collecting wood, like timber from old houses, and starting construction on the school. And so he said he learned a lot of really valuable skills, really valuable building skills, which he still uses to this day. But they built the school for us, and so when we turned 5, we were off to this cult school.
Could I ask a bit about your mom's journey, or just ladies in general?
Mm-hmm.
As I'm sure you're well aware, as you're got older and you're got exposed to different kinds of Christianity, there are a lot of fundamentalist groups that, although they would kind of say on paper, we just want to support women and blah blah blah, we want to make them feel built up. There's in Christ there's neither male nor female. We want to honor women, and God has made them wonderfully, and we want to honor their gifts. But when you come down to it, in terms of the actual options, for a lot of women, there's immense pressure to just bear children. In many cases, bear as many as you can, or at least a fair number of them, and to be a stay-at-home mom. And if you don't do that, it's kind of like you're looked down on, and it's seen as the best life. Would you say that was parallel, and what else would you add to that in terms of what options the women in the church faced?
Well, if we're talking about the cult, there was no option. So you weren't allowed to work. If you're a woman, you weren't allowed to work. Even the ones who weren't married, who were single, they were, I think mum had a job, and I think there was another couple of women who had jobs, but you were discouraged from working, and there wasn't a discussion about it. Like, you just weren't allowed to. So I can't imagine what that must have been like, because you weren't allowed to do pretty much any form of entertainment. You weren't allowed to work. You weren't allowed to really go anywhere on holiday. They discouraged that later as well, because they didn't want you to miss any of the numerous meetings that they had per week. So I feel like for the women in that cult, they just didn't have the option. Even men, Dad was saying that you had to get a job approved by the leaders. You weren't allowed to just do anything that you wanted to do. You were not allowed to go to university. So Dad ended up leaving school at 15 because the higher education was discouraged and university just wasn't allowed. And so he had to run whichever job he wanted to do past the elders of the church. They also discouraged trades. So you weren't allowed to take up a trade, because you would have had to go to night school and you would have missed church meetings. One of my uncles did actually pick up a trade, and the reason was that they discovered that they actually needed some tradespeople to work on the school and to become a little bit skilled. So he was allowed to do a trade. He became an electrician. But yeah, so it was completely restricted. Females were completely restricted. Men it was quite restricted. Yeah.
What was courtship like? Like how did people find each other?
Yeah, so I think the man would go to the elders of the church, and he would say, I am interested in this woman over here. Can I pursue that? And they would say either yes or no. And if they said yes, they would dictate when you were allowed to see each other. It was usually just at church, and when you had to get married. So they would say, right, you're interested in that woman, you're going to get married over here like 3 months from now. And so that's what happened to my parents. I think, and this is the thing that I find quite difficult to understand, for different people, they sort of sometimes had different rules. So for one couple, they might have said, you need to wait to get married for like 2 years or whatever it is. And then for, say, another couple, it was you need to get married in a couple of months kind of thing. So it was, the marriages were sort of semi-arranged. And so, yeah, they had the say on who you could, I don't want to say date, because it was really just who you could get married to. So my dad approached them and said that he was interested in my mum, and they said, sorry, but no, she's not. She wasn't like an original member of the church, because they also wanted original members to get married to original members. And Dad said that there was only like maybe three girls at the time that were original members, and he was not interested in any of them. And so he decided to just leave it. And then I think a year or two later, I think they changed the rules for somebody. Somebody was allowed, one of the original members were allowed to get married to somebody who wasn't. And so Dad went to them and said, look, these people are allowed to do this. So I would like to, date or marry this woman. And so that's what happened. And so I think they saw each other at church, and I think Dad might have visited my mum at her workplace because she was still working at that point. And so 3 months after they met, essentially, they got married in a weird little ceremony at the church, and all the women had to wear this specific white capey dress thingy and a white hat, and it was the same. It was sort of the same for all the women, and they often did, and you also had to carry a white Bible, very important. And they also had several people getting married on the same day usually. So my parents had their wedding with another 2 couples, I think, at least one, but possibly 2. Yeah,
that's not
so
fair.
it's quite interesting. Yeah. So in the family photo albums, we have photos of all these random people and their wedding parties and things. So once my mum and my dad got married, Mum had to stop working at her job.
I guess it's better than that. I think I'm thinking of the right group when I say the Moonies, where they do like a couple.
I've not heard of them.
I think I might be mistaken, but it's a group that I think they do like hundreds of people at a time, where it's just it's like they get a whole stadium of people. And I think if I'm not incorrect on this, I think the people are just like they're matched, like they really don't know each other. Like the spiritual leaders just come along and kind of say, you there, young man, you're with her, like, and stand together, and we'll do the ceremony in 30 minutes or something. I think there's a big group that does that. It's must be quite an experience, but
that's crazy.
2 or 3 is better than 1,000.
Yep, totally.
In terms of the women that went through it, I know you obviously were young at the time, but did you get the sense though that the women were really delighting in the culture of it? Because I know one of the things that strikes me a lot is, now that I've escaped, I look at a lot of the dynamics in churches, and I think it's so misogynistic, it's so sexist, it's so patriarchal. And it's, for lack of a better expression, I'm like, what's wrong with you guys? Like, can't you see how mean this is to women? But when you're in it, the women, from my experience, will by and large defend it voraciously and say, this is the best life ever. Did you get the sense that the women felt oppressed while they were in it? Or do you think they were thinking like, this is great. Like, look what God has done. He's given me a husband and a family. I've got a great church. Like, this is the kingdom of God on earth. Like, I couldn't ask for much more than this. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm not sure. I was possibly a wee bit young, but I think that it was different for everyone. Like, I think some women probably felt, like that, like, this is great. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. And then I think a lot of other women were sort of like, this is what I have to do. This is what's expected of me, especially because they knew that if they tried to go against the church, they would just be excommunicated. Like, that's just what happened, which means, like, no contact with anyone in the church. So if your whole family was in the church and you got excommunicated, you were not allowed to see any of your family members. You weren't allowed to talk to them. You were completely shunned, I guess would be another term for it. So that's something that you don't want to happen. And that's something that a lot of people can't understand. They're like, well, couldn't your family just like leave the cult? Couldn't they just leave and go somewhere else if they weren't happy? Because it did get to the point where especially my dad wasn't happy. But what you don't understand is that is huge. Like you would be saying goodbye to your parents and your siblings and your friends and everyone, and you just were completely cut off from that whole part of your life, and that was your life. Like that was it. Yeah.
Would they shun you for leaving?
Well, you would be. It's more that it wouldn't really be your choice, so you would be like kicked out essentially, and they wouldn't talk to you anymore. Like no one was allowed to talk to you.
Just say, for example, someone said, I'm just making something up here, but say somebody said, you know what, my elderly mother is in a nursing home facility that's an hour away from the church, and there's a great house we can buy. We're going to move near her, help take care of her, be with her every day, and just love her, and till her time has passed. But it's just too far to come to the church anymore. What would have happened to people that try to just, for good reasons, said we just can't come anymore?
Well, I mean, that's completely not acceptable. Okay. You would be that would do it. You would be gone. They'd just say, okay, well, sorry, but we can't. You're not part of this congregation anymore.
And if you if someone did move away like that, and then they bumped into someone from the congregation, especially someone in leadership, at the grocery store, mm-hmm. Do you think they would have spoken to them, or would they have just ignored them?
I think they might have. It's hard to say, to be honest, because it depends on the person. Mm-hmm. Some people might have tried to sort of say a quick hi, but if you were caught talking, like if somebody else from the church caught you talking to that person, then you would be in big trouble. So an example of this is my mum's mum, so my gran, she wasn't part of the church, and neither was her father, who she didn't really see anyway, but we weren't really allowed to see my mum's mum. We did see her very occasionally, like I remember a couple of times when we were really little before the church changed. So I think mum found that really hard, because my gran was also, she was a wee bit unwell, mentally, like she wasn't, I guess now you'd call it anxiety, and there would be a whole list of stuff that she had. She was in and out of a psychiatric hospital, like a sort of like an outpatient, day patient. Yeah. And so we weren't allowed to see her or have contact with her, which I think was really hard for my mum, but also for her. I don't think she really understood why that was. And so once we sort of got out of the cult, we were actually allowed to see her a little bit more. Well, I mean, we were allowed to see her, whenever, but it was one of those situations where the damage had been done, and it's quite hard to come back from that. If you've sort of shunned a family member, it's quite difficult to build on that relationship again. The
reason I was asking was I have been speaking with several Jehovah's Witnesses in the last few months, and mm-hmm. I was not aware of this growing up as much, but if you leave them, they won't talk to you. I mean, they'll just literally turn their back to you, and you do not exist to them if you leave, mm-hmm. which is just, and that includes your own parents, your own siblings. Yep. Everyone has to just turn their back on you.
Wow.
Heartbreaking stuff.
Yeah.
You mentioned you said while we were in the cult, what was the timeline in terms of how long you all were involved with that, and how the way the church dynamic worked?
Yeah, so we were involved with that until the early 90s, so like 1990, 1991 is when things sort of started to change. So it was going back to the whole, certain things were okay for some people, but they weren't okay for other people. And my dad fell into the latter category, and he really didn't like that. He got quite frustrated with the double standard and the lack of flexibility. And so he, as I mentioned earlier, he got in trouble for a couple of things, and he sort of said, he told me recently that he was sort of just waiting, sort of biding his time for when he could sort of try and make a move and get some of the other congregation to sort of see that the elders were really not great people, and they were really sort of, the whole situation just wasn't really a good situation. And so what happened was, I'm just trying to think here. This is trying to get my timeline straight.
Well, as you're thinking, I'll just add, it's kind of like one of the words that comes to my mind is power hungry. I mean, just
very.
That's just crazy. Yes. And the fact that could evolve so deeply, where people would put up with that for so long, and it sounds like maybe some kind of favoritism or something. People are like, wow, that's just crazy.
Yeah, there was a weird like hierarchy of, who could sort of get away with more and who, wasn't allowed to get away with anything. And so I think it basically stemmed from, they had started excommunicating people sort of left, right, and center, coming up with stuff that they may or may not have done to get them out, because they might have been questioning things, or they might have pushed back on an issue, or so the one specific thing that happened was my uncle's sister-in-law. She was questioning hairstyles, so she wanted to wear her hair slightly differently, or something. So there was something about a hairstyle, something ridiculously small, and they had a meeting where they said, and I should probably say that they had, I think, 4 or 5 meetings a week, and these would go on like for, I think, an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours, long meetings. And so they had a members only meeting on a Tuesday night, where only the members of the congregation, the ones who were there every week, who were part of, really part of it, they would go. And so at one of these meetings, the elders sort of brought up this woman and said that she's been immoral, she's been doing these things that she shouldn't have been doing, basically just making up this whole big story about what she'd been doing. They just wanted to get her out of the church. And so my uncle obviously knew that this was just completely false. And so she also had a few brothers that were in the church as well. And they obviously knew that this was completely false. And so they had this big meeting and talked about things. And I think my dad stood up and said, basically just supported her and said that this, guys, this is not okay. We can't do this. Her brothers also, said the same things. And he was called later on in the week. They were going to call him in for this big meeting. His dad, my granddad, actually rang him and said, you're in big trouble. You need to retract what you've said. They're calling you into this meeting next week on this specific day. As it happens, it was the day that my mum was going to be induced. She was carrying twins, and she was going to be induced on this day. And they were adamant that he was going to come on it in to church on this day, and they had this big meeting where they would reprimand him for what he said. He was obviously not going to go into that meeting because he needed to be at the hospital. That happened, and they eventually they got the leaders it was like a sort of a more closed elders meeting, and there were these two. They were the sons of the original, or one of them was his son and the other one was this other guy of the original person that started this church. And so they sort of decided to say, this one elder, this is not okay, you've been saying stuff, this is a lie, basically, and got him to admit that it was a lie. They got him to step down from his position of leadership. And then the following week, they did the exact same thing to the other guy who was the leader. So basically, they managed to get these two leaders out because they caught them in this really awful lie about this person. And that sort of started the change, I guess. And also, I can't remember the timeline exactly, but a wee while later, they had a pastor come down from up north, up in the North Island, to come and talk to the congregation. I think it was a Saturday meeting or something, to talk to them about servant leadership, and about that was his whole sort of, sermon was on servant leadership. The elders didn't particularly, the rest of the elders that were left, they didn't particularly like what he said, and they tried to ask him to retract what he said. This is this complete random pastor. And my dad stood up in the meeting and, basically stood up for this guy and said he doesn't need to retract what he said, because what he said was really good. Like, we should be listening to this. And he actually managed to get a lot of support from the rest of the congregation on, on his side, basically, And so he, from there, because the rest of the congregation were kind of on his side and were kind of waking up a little bit to what was going on, that's when things sort of started to change. It's really difficult to understand how this change happened, like how they managed to get everyone on their side, because everyone was fully like believing in these elders and what they were saying and all these rules that they had to follow. But I think perhaps it had gotten to the point where it was just ridiculous, that they were starting to wake up. So it started to change, and they got various other pastors in and other church leaders in to sort of try and re-educate the congregation, because they'd been brainwashed for so long that it's quite difficult to sort of then turn around and say, oh, okay, I'm allowed to like wear pants, or I'm allowed to wear clothes that actually have colors, because before then you weren't allowed to wear any clothes that were like had colors or patterns. So you were allowed to wear really dull, creams and grays and browns, and maybe like a really dull blue if you wanted to, but that was it. So wearing and being allowed to put on makeup again, like women that you weren't allowed to wear makeup.
Wow.
So trying to re-educate everybody. Another thing, so married couples weren't allowed to sleep in the same bed. They had to sleep in single beds. They were allowed to sleep in the same room. Just re-educating everybody. Like, they really had a hold on every single area of our lives.
That is so hard to wrap your mind around. It's just the idea that they would be willing to prescribe to that level, and the people would even put up with it. I mean, I understand it, especially from some of the conservative background I've been exposed to in my time at college. Honestly, some of that stuff, the people at the college at that time, at least I think it's changed a little bit since I left, but at that time, a lot of them would have been like, yeah, so what? Like, that's what we do too. Like, what's your point?
Yeah.
But it's crazy. And once you're out of it, I'll just want to add this real quick from my standpoint. When I was a Christian and I went to this school, again, it was called Bob Jones University. People told me, if you go there, it's going to feel really like a shock to your system, because it's so strict. They tell you everything, you literally cannot leave the campus without special permission. They need to know exactly where you're going, who you're going to be with, at what time you'll be back. You cannot be seen with a young lady after dusk. You cannot be walking, even if you're just walking her back to her dorm. You can't do it. You gotta say goodnight before the sun goes down. Endless rules, certainly the haircut kind of stuff. And they said, if you're not used to it, it's going to be a shock to your system. And I remember when I first went, they were right, it was a bit of a shock to my system. But it was a funny thing that happened after the first semester, meaning the first 3 or 4 months. Then you went on holiday for Christmas, you come back. The second semester of that year, it began to feel more like home. It began to feel normal. And I would have said at the end of that time frame that they were honoring God the best that they knew how, and that was probably the closest that I would have, at that time, I would have said the closest that I could get to saying this is a godly life. These people are living for Jesus in every way they can. They're not just saying, Jesus, we love you generically. They're saying we specifically are pulling apart every piece of our lives and saying, God, how can I honor you in my appearance? How can I honor you in what I do, where I walk, and who I'm with, what I read, everything? And when you're in it, it really feels very comforting, especially when you have a big enough group around you where everyone else is saying, yeah, this is how we do it. This is how we do it. And I mean, just in terms of, I don't know if it was like that in your church, but predominantly the school is also mostly white people. So it's like
Yeah.
99% white people all looking the same, all doing
Yep.
the same rules. It just it feels very, I mean, you when you're out of it, you're like, wow, we were just insulated and it was sheltered. But when you're in it, it just
Yeah.
feels like, wow, this is really the way that this is what the kingdom should look like. And on this side of heaven, this is what life should look like when people of God do life together. And I was proud of it. I was very proud of it. And when I left, I went to a different Bible college for the remaining 3 years of my college time, but it was comparatively much more liberal. Not liberal in terms of theology, but it's liberal in terms of the rules. And I remember that was a reverse shock. I was like, what in the world? Like, are we even going to think about living for Christ, or do you guys just not even care anymore? Like, you're listening to the Beatles? Are you kidding me? Like, why would you listen to the Beatles? They don't honor God at all. And it was a reverse shock. It was fascinating. But anyway, I digress there. Well, when you were, I wanted to make sure I understood your timeline. So you were a little child when you were in this, but you were born into it. But at what point did the church shift, and did you all stay in the church after they became healthier, for lack of a better term?
Yeah. So we did stay in the physical building, and most of the congregation stayed. There was, I think, about 40 to 50 that wanted to keep the old way of doing things, and they, went off and they continued on in their little cult. It may or may not still be going today somewhere in Christchurch.
They're poor children.
Yeah, exactly. I can't imagine growing up, like being older in that situation, especially being a teenager. It would have been just awful. So I was probably around 6 when it started to really change. So when we went to school, we had to call our teachers brother and then their last names, or sister and then their last names. No, actually, it might have even been their first names. Yeah, it was. It was their first names, so we called them sister, somebody. And so the year that I noticed that it had changed was when I was 7. So I would have been in, we call it year 3, at the 3rd year of school. And so we didn't know what to call our teacher. Nobody knew, because we were in that sort of transition. And so we just ended up calling her by her first name. And then it was the year after that we started calling our teachers Mr. and Mrs. So from a child's perspective, that's when I really noticed that things had started to change. I was also allowed to wear pants, which was awesome, and shorts even, which was great. So yes, so from a child's perspective, that's sort of when it started to change. From my parents' sort of perspective, they, as I mentioned, they got different pastors in to try and sort of re-educate people and to sort of change their way of thinking and to try and undo some of the by that point you couldn't really undo stuff. It was just sort of mitigating the damage a little bit. And so they ended up getting a lovely couple to come and take over the leadership of the church. I think this was in like 1995 maybe, ish. And they took over the church, and they were lovely, and they did some really great things in terms of helping people sort of overcome some of the trauma, I guess. Well, some of the surface trauma, the deeper trauma that's going to stay with them forever. But since then, a lot of the marriages that happened in the church have dissolved, because these people were sort of meeting people for the first time and then getting married very quickly afterwards. There was no sort of getting to know you period of time, and then maybe you're not right for me, so we'll move on from this relationship. There was absolutely none of that. So as you can imagine, people that perhaps maybe wouldn't have ended up together, ended up being married, and of course it didn't end up working out. And I guess like I was sort of one of the luckier ones where my parents stayed together until I was late teens. And there was very little sort of emotional trauma around their separation. I could for me personally, I can't speak to how my sisters felt about it, but for me personally, I could see that they were both unhappy and that they were both needing to separate so that they could, be a bit healthier and happier. And and now they're great, and it's totally great now. But so I
great in the sense that they came back together, or that they moved on?
No, that they both sort of moved on. So my dad remarried 13 years ago, and his wife is lovely, and we have a really great family situation. And my mum is happy; she's living by herself, and she's happy, and she lives quite close. So we see each other quite often, which is really nice. And so for me, I feel that ended up okay, but I know for a lot of other people, it wasn't such a good situation. Does that sort of answer?
Yeah, that's interesting. I feel bad for those situations, and but it's very, I think it's very common, even just in traditional churches, where you maybe don't have to go to the elders for permission, but you still don't get a chance to really know the person. The idea of chaperones and staying very, very pure, it's hard to get to know someone in that context. And anyway, I was curious. So we've talked a lot about the surface of the church's beliefs in the sense of how they ask you to live, but it's the fact that they had another church come in later and help kind of bring things back to a sense of normalcy makes me think that their theology, it makes me wonder if their theology really wasn't that far off, because it sounded like they needed some help healing from some leadership abuses, but they didn't need to help from the sense of theology being so bizarre. The fact that they could keep a church, just bring some other churches in, but keep the original church intact. Sounds like they were probably not too far off the deep end, too far in the deep end. Is that fair to say, or were there some weird theological stances that they took, or how did they land? Like, what would you, if you didn't know what denomination they were, what would you have compared them to? Were they like Baptists or Presbyterians, or what's the closest?
I would say, have you heard of like the Closed Brethren Church?
I've not.
Okay. I would say it's probably comparable to, like, the actual core doctrines is probably comparable to a lot of really conservative churches.
Okay.
Like ultra conservative churches.
Protestant churches.
Sure. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
So in terms of re-education, you're right in that it was mostly the surface level stuff, like how to operate sort of in the real world, because a lot of people just didn't know because they'd been brought up in this. And so, little things, like you're allowed to sleep in the same bed now that you're married kind of thing. Like there's that sort of thing. Or, there was one rule about hair washing and how many times a week you're allowed to wash your hair. Somebody asked. And that's the thing. If you ask, they will give you a rule about it. So my parents just stopped asking. Yeah. So
that's really
I
funny.
think that, yeah, I know. So for the doctrine that they had, like underneath it all, it was the Jesus is you need to give your life to Jesus. But one thing that the cult did differently in terms of theology and doctrine was that the leaders were sort of God's voice. And so one of the verses, I think my dad told me this verse, and I think it's 1 Corinthians, something about honoring your elders. Hang on, I've actually just got it written down. I'm just going to have a quick little look. Oh yeah, so this verse talks about how you must give double honor to the elders. That's the first part of the verse, and that is the part that they focused on, that you have to give double honor to the elders of the church, and that was kind of the focus of their doctrine. I mean, I think the verse goes on to say the ones that are worthy of this honor, and they completely left that part out So that's probably where it differs. But the main points of Christianity, or regular Christianity, that there is a God who created the world, and that he sent his son Jesus to die for our sins, and you need to repent and have him as your Lord and Savior. That was still part of their main doctrine.
Well, how did that relate to your journey? Like, did you, like, for example, in a lot of churches that I grew up in, you would have what we would have called an altar call or some kind of equivalent to it, where they would say, maybe there'd be few sermons in a row from Sunday to Sunday where they're just talking about some specific passage, but they wouldn't let too many Sundays go before they would bring it back to a clear gospel message. Or if they're kind of doing it in an expository sense, where they're going verse by verse, and maybe the gospel hasn't come up in a while very specifically in that passage, they would still find a way to bring it in. And they would want to, at the end of a lot of services, say, so I'm now turning my attention away from the passage and what it's meaning. I'm turning my attention to you all in the congregation. And I know there's some of you out there who have heard these words, but you're not actually listening to them as someone who's given your life and your heart to Jesus. You're listening to someone who's just thinking about it and researching, weighing things, but you haven't actually come to the cross. And then they would begin a declaration of, like, look, you have a problem, your sin problem. Jesus is the solution. Your sin's going to take you to death and to hell, but the solution is, Jesus Christ is your substitute. And then they'd give, of course, the final invitation, like, who here among you is willing to bow your knee, so to speak, at the foot of the cross and give your life to Christ? And sometimes use that verbiage. Sometimes they'd be much more theologically specific and say, who's willing to say, Jesus, I believe that you are my substitute. I take all of my sin. I turn from myself, from my sin to you. I place my sin at the foot of the cross. And I ask you, please forgive me for my sins, and please put your righteousness as my covering. And when you do, identify with his death and resurrection that way, that is in fact the salvation, the path to salvation. That's the road to be saved. And they would ask people, like, who here, they would even do these very emotional things where they'd be like, all right, everyone bow your head, no one looking, every head bow, every eye closed. If you want to talk to somebody right now about how to give your life to Christ, raise your hand. No one else can see you. Just the elders who are, around the building, and they'd play the music to kind of evoke an atmosphere. And they would say, who wants to? And they sometimes, if they didn't have anybody, they would just keep on going. They'd be like, I know there's someone out there. Yep. You're not doing it because you're ashamed, or you don't want to confess your sin. You're afraid someone's looking. Like, I guarantee you, no one's looking at you. Just me and the elders can see. Raise your hand. You might die on the way, in a car crash on the way home tonight. This might be your last chance to turn to Christ. Please don't lose this chance. It might be your last one. Tomorrow's not promised. And they try to get someone, and then, but the conclusion was, the man or woman comes with the elder, to the pulpit or to the some back room, and they do a prayer to say, I actually make this transaction with God. I want this peace. And at that point, they would have called him a Christian. Said, you just got saved. Would you have said that was similar for you in any way in terms of the dynamic of the salvation message? And did you ever have that?
So I'm laughing because this is so familiar and I haven't thought about it in years and years. But for when I went, when the church changed, and when I eventually changed churches and went to a different church, definitely that was definitely a big part of what they did on a Sunday morning. Whereas part of the cult, they didn't really do altar calls, I don't think. They definitely had that message, that you need to be right with God, you need to be saved, or, eternal damnation will happen. That was definitely the message, but I really don't, and I could be wrong, but I don't think that they had any altar calls. What they did do, though, is they recorded every message and made sure that there was enough tapes for everyone to take tape home. So aside from the hours and hours you have spent in meetings all week, you were expected to re-listen to these meetings on tape. And I think that the salvation sort of message, they wanted you to do that sort of in your own, private time. Now, as I said, I could be wrong about this, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't a very, like go up the front and do this type of thing. That definitely happened later when I wasn't a cult. Yeah.
So was there ever a time, whether it was in church or just with your parents or by yourself, that you ever gave your life to Christ, turned your life over to Him?
So I don't remember like a specific time when I was a child. I definitely did multiple times. I can more so remember doing that sort of around the age of like 10, 11, 12 and going forwards. But when I was just like really little, I don't remember a time when I said the sinner's prayer. I must have, maybe, I don't really know. My sister definitely, one of my sisters remembers a specific time when she was, 4 or 5, that age that you get to. She definitely remembers a time, but I sort of don't really remember doing that when I was really little. It was more sort of a wee bit older, but then also that sort of constant fear that you weren't saved and that you needed to make sure that you were right with God. And so, you would say the sinner's prayer, multiple times.
Was the theology leaning more towards the idea of that if you were saved once for real, you were saved forever? Or was it more like you could be truly saved and then fall away because you were just too worldly or not living for Christ?
So what I got growing up was sort of a combination of the two, if that makes sense. So like, yes, like when you gave your life to God, you were saved and that was it. Like you were sort of in. But like, what if you did something that meant that you weren't right with God? Or like, what if, say 6 months had gone past and I'd maybe done this thing and this thing, like I'd lied to somebody, or I'd, taken some of my dad's money, or, just stupid little things that kids do. And like, I wasn't right with God anymore, so I needed to pray that prayer again to make sure that I was okay. When I was a little bit older, like when I was a teenager, I had a little bit more of an understanding about grace and about how that sort of comes into it with like what Jesus did and how that sort of means that I'm saved. But if you decide to turn your back on God and walk away, like what I've done now, not saved anymore, going to hell. Yeah.
It's interesting, toward the last part of my years as a Christian, and I'm thinking of a pretty big chunk of it, I guess, but I got pulled into what is known as Calvinism. Are you familiar with Calvinism?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Did you feel like you were ever of that mindset?
Oh, very briefly when I was a teenager, I sort of, I don't know what I was reading. I was reading something. And yeah, that whole predestination thing, it somehow made sense to me.
Yeah.
And so that had me a little bit worried for a while there. What if I wasn't one of the ones that he had predestined and called? And yeah, but I think I got over that after a little while and realized that that's probably not what it means. And I think I was part of a different church at that point, and part of what they taught was that wasn't really how it was. But it's very confusing because there are verses in the Bible that talk about that. Romans, is that correct?
Yeah, Romans 9.
Yeah, and so yeah, it was a bit confusing because the Bible talked about that, but then the church that I was going to didn't really believe in that. It's just, yeah.
Well, it's interesting. Are you familiar with C.S. Lewis?
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, so I love C.S. Lewis.
Not talking about Calvinism at all, but just his conversion story. He talked about how he really didn't want to be a Christian. He really didn't want to believe, and he thought it was probably not true and so forth. And he just felt like it was unscientific to be a Christian and so forth. And he talks about how he went kicking and screaming, so to speak, into the kingdom. Like it was like as if God's angels were just pulling him in and saying, "No, you're gonna believe because we're real." And it's funny. I felt like I could have reiterated a similar dynamic twice in my life. Once was with Calvinism. I was at Bob Jones University, and we had to go to their chapel for Sunday morning church services. Like we had chapel with them every day, and then you had Sunday morning chapel too, which was the church. So you're with Bob Jones Chapel Church, 5-6 times a week. But the one time they'd let you go to an outside church was on Sunday night. So you picked one of their pre-approved churches. They had all the churches in the area. They said, "This is your list of 20 churches. You pick one." And I picked this really good Baptist church, really good in quotes. But I knew the pastor because he was also one of the teachers, and I just loved him. I could have sat there at that time and listened to him speak for 10, 12, 15 hours at a time. He was just so good. I loved listening to him. It felt like he had, like when I was a Christian, as a young man, I felt like no one was really giving me like what I would have called the meat of the word. It was just like milk, 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 and no meat. And it felt like like for every hour that this man spoke and I actually listened to him, it was like an hour with him was like worth a year's worth with all the other previous pastors and teachers. It was so good. And so when I found out I was, of course, allowed to go to his church, I was like, of course. And he was preaching through Romans 8 and 9 in Sunday evening. So Romans 8's always talking about, you're secure, you're in Christ, and just praising God for how he's doing it. And it's so you're so secure in God. And then the obvious question comes up, well, if you're so secure in God, then what in the world happened to Israel? If we're so secure, they were his people, they all died in the desert. So it didn't sound very secure and so he's transitioning in Sunday nights from Romans 8 to Romans 9, and he's going through these passages talking about election. Well, there's an Israel, but there's a true Israel. And it's like, all of Israel is not Israel. There are people that are Jews by birth. They're not Israelis by heart. They don't have the heart of God in them. And going through this, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. I have the right to choose, a piece. I have the right to take a clay piece and to take this clay and mold it into something wonderful and something for dishonor that I just smash in its trash. I'm the potter. I have the right to do that. And the clay does not have the right to talk back to the potter and say, "Why'd you make me this way?" You don't do that. Pottery doesn't talk back to the pottery maker. And so he's preaching through this. And he was literally doing altar calls about Calvinism in a Baptist church. He's like, look, when I get to a passage that says you have the responsibility to come to Christ, it's all on you. You have the free will to come to Christ. Like, I'm not going to take the teeth out of that passage. I'm going to preach it like it stands. You have the free will to come to Christ. He said, when I come to a passage that talks about election, I'm not going to take the teeth out of it either. I'm going to preach it like it stands. And it says God is the one who does the choosing. And he said, I literally want you all to say, is that if any of you in this Baptist church are refusing to bow your knee to this passage, this is God's word. And he was doing altar calls, not just to get people saved, but to say, will you bow your knee that Romans 9 is true and God's word, and you will believe it and support it. And so I was like, wow, holy smokes, Calvinism. And that was my first exposure. And I kind of went kicking and screaming into it. And then, of course, when I switched Bible colleges, there were a lot more Calvinists there. I think Bob Jones is more Baptist, which tends to be more Arminian. And by the time I was done that Bible college, I was like, the Bible teaches a Calvinistic perspective. God chooses it. And I loved it. I thrived in it because the perspective it gives you is all the glory goes to God. I didn't start this. I didn't do the actual work of salvation on the cross, of course, but I didn't start the whole plan. I didn't make the plan in eternity past. I didn't choose God. And when you get to like even the simple verses of John 3:16, it talks about, in the John 3 passage, it says, you must be born again. Well, none of us had any say in whether we were born the first time. None of us said, hey, mom and dad, please come together and so I can be born. We were completely passive in it. And so it made sense to say, yeah, you are not active in your birth the first time. You're not active in your birth the second time. You're just born. And it even says, the spirit goes where it wants to and does what it wants to do. And I was like bowing my knees, as it were, to God, that he was truly sovereign in the act of salvation. And to me, that was a beautiful thing. And then I'll just add shortly, the other time that I went kicking and screaming was out of Christianity, when I dove deep into the mythology and realized none of this is true. I was like, no, this has to be true. It has to be true. Anyway, I wanted to get back to the salvation question. When you were a Christian, not talking about the whole maybe I sinned and maybe I should be concerned if I'm saved, but just the good times. Did you have like devotions with Christ? Time, I would call them devotions. You tell me what word you would use, but times when you're just like you and your Bible and God. What was that like?
Yeah, so backtracking slightly from that, just in my early 10 years, I wasn't really into church. So sort of say 13 to sort of 16, I wasn't really that into it. I found it a bit boring. I actually became a Sunday school teacher, but for really little kids, because I've always really loved working with kids. And so I loved doing that every Sunday morning instead of being in church. So I did that for a long time. But then I was going out with a boy from school, and he went to a different church, and I started going along to that church, and I started to really like that church and the people there, like, as well. A lot of the kids my age were just really into it, really into God, really into having devotions. We called it quiet time. And so I remember, I think I must have been about 16, rededicating my life to God and deciding that I would, from then on, be a Christian and follow God. And so, so I'd never really heard about quiet times. It wasn't, my old church didn't really talk about that so much. So it was a wee bit of a foreign concept to me, but I got the gist pretty quickly. So I started, just praying and reading my Bible. I mean, I'd always prayed, and because I like to read, I didn't find reading my Bible difficult. I sort of found it quite interesting. And so I read it a lot, and I memorized a lot of it. And because I had, been in church, been at a Christian primary school, been, I think you call it elementary school, I'm not sure, like when you're young, and then I went to and then I went to a different Christian high school as well, so it was very sort of insulated in this Christian bubble. And so I got a lot of Christian input, I guess, over the years. I would now call it brainwashing. So I definitely had devotions. I was all in. I was very serious about being a Christian. Even some of my friends at school were not Christian enough, for me. And so I ended up hanging out with a lot of my church friends. They would be the people that I would sort of gravitate towards, especially on a Sunday. Like, we would hang out all day kind of thing, and then go to church at night.
With your quiet time, did you feel like you had a sense of God being present, or even prayers being answered, whether it was something literal like, God, please let this happen, and it happened, or even just like a very quasi thing of like, God, I'm very anxious, I need your peace that passes all understanding, and you would find it, coming into your emotional state. Like, what kind of like really like internal experience did you have with this God character?
Like every day I would experience that sort of connectedness and asking for things, and God, giving me peace about a certain situation, or making me feel less anxious about it. Totally. That happened all the time. As simple as helping me find a parking space, when I was driving, just ridiculous things like that. And like, I used to pray about all these random different little things, and I would definitely feel like God was answering my prayers on a lot of things. I mean, some things, he didn't. So
did that dynamic of him not answering prayers, just even the general concept of his will, what his will was for you, what job you get, what guy you date, blah blah blah, like, did that concern you, that it was at times very much a nebulous answer? Like, And did you ever have anything where you were like, I think God has just opened the door. He has given me a green light and it didn't work out? Anything like that where it was very confusing?
Yeah, I feel like that did happen sometimes. And I would sort of excuse it as being part of God's will, and who knows the will of God, and he's so big and much bigger than me and my situation, and holy and righteous, and all of that. One situation that did bother me a little bit was that I am partially blind in my left eye, and so that happened when I was 10-ish, as a result of chickenpox, one of the little known side effects. And so we got prayer for that on multiple occasions, like for healing. It never happened, obviously. And so I think that was one of the things that I was a little bit like, like, why isn't God healing this? Like, it'd be nice to, have two eyes that work properly. But, so that was one of the things that, and you just kind of excuse it as a Christian as being, well, who knows the will of God? Yeah.
It's interesting that you talk about the healing thing. I had the same thing. It's a long story for another time, but just in a nutshell, I had very, very severe insomnia for about 25, 30 years of my life. And I just couldn't sleep. It got worse and worse and worse. And I moved from Pennsylvania down here to Georgia. I know you don't probably know the country too well, but it's quite a difference of about, depending on how fast you're driving, 12 to, or if you have kids in the car that need to stop for the potty every 2 hours, it's between a 12 and a 16-hour trip. But I moved from Pennsylvania to Georgia for a very special doctor around the age of 30 who fixed it very quickly with no medicine in like a month. It was an amazing story. But for like 25, 30 years, I'm like, I just cannot ever get a good night's sleep. I just, 3 decades of my life, I didn't sleep well. It was really hard. But I was like, and I'd always chalk it up to there must, like, this is part of God's purifying process. Like, he's doing something, he's teaching me something through it. And it was always nebulous. I was just going to make a comment and then a question too about the thing about a parking space. It's so weird, but when you step back from it, especially like now, it's like, wait a second. So he's going to help me find a parking space, but he couldn't answer the prayers of the people in concentration camps, in World War II. Like, he couldn't help them avoid the genocide, but he'll help me. Or for us, American football, like, these guys will, they'll just get what we call a touchdown or whatever, and they'll slam the ball, and then they'll get down on one knee, like, thank you, God, for helping me get this touchdown. I'm like, so he helped you in this game where you're making, $10 million. He's helping you to get a touchdown, but he won't help people escape, the horrors of war. And did it ever amaze you, either when you're in it or now that you're out of it, to think that was the way you thought?
Yeah, now that I'm out of it, definitely. I think at the time there were thoughts that would pop in like that, but I would quickly get rid of them because it was too hard to try and wrap my head around that at the time. Yeah, but definitely think about it now. Yeah.
And I guess too, from a holistic worldview perspective, you want to thank God for anything good that happens in life. As Amy Grant would have said, anything good that happens in life, it's from Jesus. Wanted to ask, before you go into, I know there's a lot more stages we haven't touched on yet, but I wanted to make sure I narrow down a few more things from your kind of between your, not necessarily the cult time, but just your young teenage time and just the formative years of your theology. First off, what did you believe about the Bible? Was it inerrant and it's fully inspired?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, so definitely believed that, God was the creator of the world. And I'm pretty certain, well, at least I did anyway, believe in a young earth sort of creation story. So the earth is 6,000 to 8,000 years old, 6,000 to 10,000, I don't know, somewhere in there. It's ridiculous. So that, and the Bible is the inerrant word of God, and that I guess he spoke through all the people that wrote the Bible, and that say, the Old Testament, this is what happened. Noah's Ark literally happened. And then of course the New Testament with Jesus. And although what's really interesting to me is that Jesus doesn't really talk about people becoming Christians. Like, it doesn't say anything in there about, the sinner's prayer or, like becoming a Christian. This is a little bit off topic, but I've always, for the last few years, sort of felt that if Jesus was an actual person, he would have been pretty disappointed at the way that people have taken what he said, taken and believed, and the wars that have been fought over it, and various awful things that have been done in his name, and even just scaling it right back to what the church believes today. I think he would be pretty disappointed, embarrassed, weirded out. Like, he wouldn't be particularly happy with how people have taken his message and run with it.
And certainly a Jew of that time would have never wanted to have words put in his mouth such as eat this flesh and drink this blood from the the Lord's Supper. That would have been horrifying to a Jew. And certainly just to say that I am equal to God. I mean, God clearly says in the Old Testament, I am God and there is no other. There's no one else like me. And to suddenly have a man who's God, and obviously as the story evolved, he eventually kind of went from being adopted as God's son to being co-equal with God, and eventually the same thing with the Holy Spirit. And all of a sudden there's like 3 in 1, whereas God's always been, God could have explained the Trinity very clearly in the Old Testament if he was real. He doesn't say it, but it's like it evolves. I agree. He would have, the Jesus character, if he was real, would have been horrified. Can I ask, in terms of two questions that I love asking them. Some people have a story about it, some people don't. But the end times, the rapture or tribulation, and demonic activity or angels and demons all around us, did either of those have any effect on your theology growing up?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so more sort of in my teenage years, I think I became a little bit more aware of that kind of stuff. So I also, when I was about 16 or 17, I started working in a Christian bookshop. And so I had access to all of the wonderful American influences on Christian culture, and all of the books that had come out, all of the music, all of that. So and because I'm an avid reader, and I had to test, the products, of course. So I read a lot of, Frank Peretti, and so that was, really, if people don't know, that's very much focused on angels and demons, and that, when you pray, you directly affect what is going on in this spiritual realm. So that sort of became part of what I believed as well. The church definitely taught about that praying can affect, that whole spiritual realm, and being aware of demonic influences. Like, growing up, my mum would never let us watch horror movies. She said that it opened a door to let that whole demonic influence in. And so I was always very careful about what I watched and what I listened to. And I was always quite aware of that sort of spiritual aspect. Sorry, what was your first?
The other one was the rapture and end times. Like,
that's right.
Was that taught in your churches too?
Yeah, I don't know whether it still is now, because I've been out of it for a while. But I definitely remember at high school being exposed to a lot of that end times, and it freaks you out. Like, when you're a teenager, and especially children as well, but when you're a teenager and you're actually starting to sort of get a better understanding of how the world works, and sort of deeper intellectual and emotional layers, it freaks you out. Like, it's pretty dark stuff. But of course, I read the Left Behind series and watched the movies.
Did they show them to you in your church too, like in special youth group events, Thief in the Night kind of stuff?
No, we never had Thief in the Night. I kind of remember if I've seen that, but no, I sort of sorted out, and because I read the books and they were really exciting, and I mean, exciting to read, but not exciting when you're like, oh, this could actually happen. But I mean, I went through a period of time where I sort of believed that, the rapture is real and this is going to happen one day. Jesus is going to come back on a cloud and call all of his believers up to heaven and then leave everyone else on earth to sort of suffer and be tormented and all the rest of it, and the Antichrist and all of that. So I believed that for a good while, probably until my early to mid 20s, I would say. I sort of, I don't know, maybe just started thinking a little bit more, and that's how it happened for me. Is it happened very, very slowly, and parts of the faith or religion, I guess, would just sort of fall away. And so I've sort of realized that, that's probably not going to happen. But, I feel sort of as if the damage had sort of been done, that whole sort of fear-based thought process on how the world was going to end and, what was going to happen to all the people in it. Yeah, so that sort of,
Can I ask about that? It sounds like we're getting close to the point where you kind of talk about your actual deconstruction, but kind of a throw in last question before you get to that stage. You're talking about the end times, and God's going to redeem some people but leave some people behind, or whatever that would look like. Did it ever bother you that what I would call the callousness of Christians, and to yourself as when you were a Christian, the callousness of Christians to the plight of the unsaved, where they're basically going to be, according to the Bible and according to a lot of denominations, they're going to be tortured forever. Meaning, if you have a sibling or a cousin or whatever, a friend that died, that they weren't in Christ, that for the rest of your life, you have to know, hopefully you'll kind of forget when you're in heaven. Heaven will be different. You'll forget that they're burning in hell. But for now, you can easily imagine it. God's left you with that imagination until you die. And, we don't know for sure in heaven if we would see them burning, or if it would be just like God's glory would just overwhelm us. We wouldn't even think about anybody else. But for now, we can imagine they're dead now. And I know up to their very dying day, they never professed Christ. So the chances of them being in heaven are slim to none. They're probably burning right now and screaming in pain. Whether it was more of a literal burning or it was more of an emotional, spiritual, psychological burning, it was literal. They're going to burn. Yeah, I mean, I believe that too. I mean, whatever version of it, there's some way in which you would all categorize it as some kind of torture. God is torturing people. Did it bother you thinking that that's happening to my friends?
Yeah, I didn't think of it as God torturing people. I thought of it as Satan and his demons torturing people. So for me, in my mind, that made that aspect of it okay. But in terms of actual people being in hell forever, that kind of freaked me out, because I used to think about, like an actual hell and what that would look like. And you try and, or at least I tried to like wrap my head around eternity and how crazy that is. So that aspect of it bothered me. And I think that I tried not to think about it too much, because it did make me quite upset. Like, what if this friend, dies now because they're not saved? They're going to go to hell. And it's not a nice thought. Like, it's just not. It's not. But now, like, for me now, looking back on this, I am absolutely horrified that is still what some people believe, that they believe that people are going to a literal hell forever. And it's terrifying. Yeah.
On that note, did you feel a strong compulsion as a result of that background to evangelize as much as you could?
Yeah, I absolutely did. Yep. I don't know if I was any good at it. But
do you ever recall anyone like praying, saying, I've been thinking about this, and based on what you just told me, I think it's time. I need to give my life to Christ. Do you recall ever taking someone over the finish line, so to speak?
Yeah, definitely. Well, also because part of my story is that I was a youth group leader for 10 years. And so the way that sort of worked for our youth group is that we would take on a group of, say, 13-year-olds, so the start of our high school, and you would be with that group ideally for the rest of their time at high school, so 5 years. And so I definitely led some of those girls to, believing in Jesus. And so that's probably the main source of evangelism for me. I felt really uncomfortable talking to like other people about it, like strangers especially. That's not really something I would do. But yeah, occasionally like friends and stuff. And this is maybe a little bit later, because when I was in high school and even after that, I was in this, as I said, this sort of Christian bubble where I didn't really have too much contact with anyone who wasn't a believer. Yeah, but I think after that, like people I met, I definitely felt like I had a responsibility to at least, if not tell them outright, but show them how a Christian was supposed to live, and show them how a person who believed in God should be. Yeah.
I don't know.
And I think, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think for me, that looked like showing them that I have my life completely together, and that I was very happy and always looking out for people, and always being there for other people, and always being the person that other people could rely on, kind of thing. And I mean, part of that is my personality, but also part of that was trying to show other people that didn't believe how a Christian was living, or how it looks to sort of, have that faith.
Yeah. Did you get the sense from the preachers that if you didn't evangelize, that their blood, the blood of those that are dying without Christ, is sort of on your hands? Like you're responsible for, kind of like if you're walking by a house that was burning and there was, say a kid right there just sitting inside the house, where even without that, not much effort, you could literally run in 5 seconds, be back out with that kid and help them escape. And if you just walked by and said, well, it's really a shame that that's happening, but I'm not going to go in and rescue them, even though I could, and even though it really wouldn't take that much effort. If you didn't, it was like as good as if you killed them. Did you get that kind of preaching as well?
Maybe not like directly, because that's extreme.
Yeah, it's hard.
Like looking back, it's extreme. But we definitely got the sense that these people, you might be the only Christian that they come across in their lives. You need to make sure that you show them God through the way that you're living. That was more sort of what we got taught. The link in the chain, so to speak. You might just be this, one link in the chain of their lives, and they might go on to, be converted by someone else down the line. But you were there for that crucial moment in their lives, and you should always be aware of that when you're talking to, or being around people that weren't believers.
Yeah, it did it with that. I know I said one question. I'm adding a few extras, but they're kind of connected. When you were talking about, you needed to be like an example where they could look at your life, and you're kind of, even if you weren't preaching the gospel per se or sharing it, you were living the gospel. Kind of like, I think it was at St. Francis of Assisi, or someone said something like, preach the gospel all the time, and if necessary, use words, something like that.
Absolutely. Yeah, that was a quote I lived by.
But which is crazy looking back, because the Bible clearly says to preach verbally, preach as much as you can. But in terms of, like, one of the things that I always struggled with was this idea. It talks about in Matthew, Jesus says, my burden is light, my yoke is easy. I'm probably switching those, flip-flopping those, but just this idea that like if you are focused on yourself, if you're focused on your sin, you're focused on the world, if you're letting the devil, manipulate you and ignore God or fight against God, that's a hard road. It's like you're purposefully putting on a backpack and adding brick after brick after brick. And so when you live for God, it's like God's taking all these bricks out and saying, I'm gonna lighten your load. It's gonna be so easy to follow me. It's going to be a beautiful path. And compared to the life of sin, it'll feel like you're no longer under this heavy weight. Truly, my yoke is easy. And so you get this sense, but then you look at so many Christians' lives, even our own, and you say, I don't feel the joy of the Lord more than I'd like to admit. Or I'm, especially once you hit puberty and sexuality, you're thinking, I know that the preacher said, have a pure mind, especially in the areas of sexuality. But where maybe in our men's groups, they wouldn't be too specific in the church, but then you get to the men's groups and they'd be like, what this application means is, and they'd be like, guys, you know what this means. It'd be like, it means if you see something that your eye went somewhere and it shouldn't stay there, it means your eye now turns away, and you can't always avoid the first look, but you can avoid the second or third look. And so, when you're in that spot where as a guy, you're thinking, the first look was accidental, but the second and third look were very intentional, and I want to keep looking. You're tempted to think, am I really exhibiting the fruit of the Spirit? And so you do get into that. We talked about this a little bit earlier, but just this whole sense of, am I really saved? And how much of a lack of fervor for God is enough evidence for me to now be concerned about my state. And also just the other side of it, though, of like, well, if it's God doing it, I don't have to like force the issue. I shouldn't have to force the fruit of the Spirit to grow. It should just be there. It just grows. A vine, that's growing grapes isn't like straining like crazy. It's just slowly enjoying the water in the ground and just drinking it up, and it just produces fruit. And it's like, this shouldn't be some kind of massive effort. It should just be happening. And I think for me, it set up a situation where at times it felt like I had to choose between what felt very much like just normal humanity or follow God. And if I ever leaned not heavily on, well, just do it God's way, if I ever leaned in towards what I would call doing it in my humanness, it felt like I was very confused as to, number one, if I'm really on fire for God and the gospel's got so much power, why do I not feel the power? And then, of course, secondarily, the side effect it would add a lot is the shame issue, especially with sexuality, where you'd be like, I mean, guys, I'm sure you've heard enough through the grapevine to know, guys would do this in these groups where they would get together and just say, I struggled, I messed up, I made it right. And you'd hear behind the scenes like, no, they keep messing up. And so you'd question, if the gospel's real and it has power and the Spirit's real and he's in us to transform us. I mean, it says Romans 12:1-2, that God's going to transform your mind. He's going to renew you. Is there power? Because it doesn't feel like there's much power going through me right now. Did that kind of dynamic ever come through your journey? And did it concern you that, like, not in the sense of am I not saved, but just why do I feel like I'm not that different from someone who didn't have Christ? Like, shouldn't this feel radically different?
Yeah, absolutely. Maybe not so much when I was a teenager, but as I got a little bit older, definitely that sense of like, why is this so difficult? Why does it feel like I'm walking uphill? In terms of what I believed, but also trying to apply that to the real world, I sort of, and I don't know whether this is slightly different from what you were just saying, but like trying to reconcile how I wanted to be and how I wanted to feel and how I actually for being a Christian, and I wanted to be so on fire for God, and I wanted to just really be in that relationship with him, whereas how I sort of warring with how I actually felt and how I kind of wanted to be freer.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah. And of course, I can hear the Christians saying, "There, you're back in Romans 5, 6, and 7. That's the flesh versus the spirit." So yeah, we always had a way to explain it as Christians.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, yeah. We could circular logic around a lot of things.
Yeah, but it definitely was I'll move on from this in a second, but it was one of the hardest parts for me, and especially when I would see people in my life who were older, like people who were retirement age, who'd been in the church, been exposed to the gospel. They were the kind of people that listened to Christian radio nonstop. And I looked at some of them and thought, you're some of the most cantankerous, ugly people that I've ever met. And I thought, you've had the gospel for 50 years. You should be like, to me, one of the biggest questions that I would ask a lot was, who do I want to be like? Because there was, sorry for dragging this on, but there was my parents went to a school called Dallas Theological Seminary. You familiar with that? It was a really big conservative kind of bastion for people that want to go into ministry, especially from a Baptist background. Dallas Theological Seminary was a big deal. My parents both went there. And there was this guy there, his name was Howard Hendricks. I'm sure he's passed. He was older way back when I was a kid. But he had this sermon that he preached to pastors where he'd say, pastors, you need to be asking yourself one big question in the midst of all the other things you're doing. And it's, where are the men? Like, where are my men? Meaning, where are the men that I mentor? Where are my mentees? Who are the people that are coming to me saying, Pastor, I need to sit under your servant leadership very closely, and I need to watch you, just kind of like you mimic Christ and I'm going to mimic you. And that really struck me as, that's what mentorship's about. But it from the side of the person looking for a mentor, the big question is then not, where are my men to mentor, but who do I, as Tim, who do I look for and say, I want to be just like you. When I grew up, I want to be, like that. There's kid commercials. But when I grew up, I want to be just like Mike. I want to be. You probably don't know that reference, but I want to be just like that pastor. Or if it was like in terms of like a couple, I'd be like, I see that couple. They're so loving. That man is so good to his wife. She's so good to him. I want to be just like them. And I remember for so many years thinking, I look around this church, I look around my family, I look around my friends. I don't want to be like any of you all, really. I don't see anybody that I want to really mimic. I want to mimic Christ, but I don't want to mimic you all. And as it hit me, that some of these people had been around the gospel for 50 years or more. I was like, that's ridiculous. That's crazy. If you've been in the gospel for 50 years, you should shine. And it should have been a bigger reason to deconvert earlier, but it wasn't, obviously. But it always bothered me.
Yeah, anyway, absolutely.
Well, feel free to comment on that if you want to anymore. And then if you could, I'd love to have you take us into the kind of the early cracks, like what started your big questions.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I was a youth group leader for 10 years. And so I took two groups of girls through youth group essentially. And I love doing it. And like I said, I love working with kids, but I also love any age, really. It's just one of those things in my life that I'm passionate about. And so the second group of girls that I had several girls who were not brought up in the church, whereas the first group, they were all sort of church kids. The second group I had were a wee bit different, and some of them were they had been brought along by a couple of their friends from church, and they decided to stay, which was awesome. It was, both groups were really, really cool. The girls were lovely, and I just loved being part of their lives. Anyway, the second group, there was this one girl that would ask, actually, they all kind of did, but there was this one girl specifically who would ask some really deep questions and some really, now, like looking back, they're such basic, normal questions. But to me, it was like radical, like whoa. So one of the questions she asked was along the lines of homosexuality. And she said that, why is being gay bad? Like, why is that a sin in the Bible, or in, I guess, is it Leviticus that it's in? I don't know if it's really mentioned again.
Probably,
maybe
yeah.
once.
Yeah, Romans 1 talks about it as well.
Yeah. And so she sort of asked, why is this bad? Like, if there are two people who are in love, who are, consenting adults, like, why is this bad? And it was just that simple question that got me thinking about life, I guess. Why is it bad? Why is it a sin? Why do people think it's a sin? And then, of course, that started me thinking about other things that the church says is a sin. Like, let's take, like sex before marriage, along the same lines. Like, why is that a sin? There's a whole list of stuff. And you're like, why is this bad? Like, yeah, so I guess that is the question. And I think that before then, I was like fully in it. Like, I was really in it. And so it was that question that led to many other questions. And at the same time, or a similar time, we'd started our family. So I had my first child when I was 26. We got married quite young as well. So my husband and I have been married for 14 years. I think I was 22 and he was 20 when we got married. So quite young.
Was he also
typical
a believer?
Oh, yeah. Typical of church marriages, I guess. And so my daughter was born, and then around the time, I think I must have been, late 20s, I had my son. And my son wouldn't sleep unless he was in his cot. He was fine in his cot. Great. He wouldn't sleep in his car seat, like in the car. You take babies for a drive and they're meant to fall asleep. He never fell asleep in his car seat. He wouldn't sleep in his pram. So we were quite sort of firm on, naps for our kids. We believed that they needed a nap. It was good for everyone. So I sort of said that I would stay home with him so that he could have his morning nap, and I would miss church. And my husband would take then 2-year-old to church. And that's, just how it went for a while. And I found that actually removing myself and being out of that environment, thoughts started to creep in, and I actually started to develop the part of my brain that is responsible for critical thinking, which is something that hadn't happened until that point. And as a sort of an aside, when I was researching spiritual trauma, so this is something for later, but anyway, when I was researching spiritual trauma, Marlene Winell's name came up quite a lot. And so I've since watched a few of her things on YouTube. And she's amazing. But one of the things she talks about is that when you're so enmeshed in this religious system of indoctrination and brainwashing, it completely squashes any sort of the part of your brain that is responsible for critical thinking. And so it's sort of almost like a developmental delay. And so I found that being out of that and actually removing myself from that, I was actually able to start thinking again, and for the first time in my life, I guess, start thinking about things in a much more logical way, and start researching. And I didn't have a lot of time, obviously, to research because I had a 2-year-old and a newborn, but sort of that, just removal from that environment was so healthy. And looking back, I don't know whether I would have been able to, continue on that. I like to think that I would have got there eventually, but it wouldn't have happened, by now if I hadn't have actually removed myself from that environment. Yeah.
It makes me think of COVID too, where there's probably a lot of that that's happened, from the last 2 years, where people are stepping back. I mean, I guess you can, with the internet, there's obviously a million replacements where you're watching sermons, right over the Facebook or YouTube or whatever, but or TV.
Yeah.
But I wonder if some of that's relatable to people as well for that reason. But that's awesome that in your situation that did people reach out to you and say like, hey, we need to make sure you get spiritual food while you're away, or were they just like, were you out of sight, out of mind?
Yeah, pretty much. So no, nobody reached out, but at the time it wasn't as if I had stopped going to church. Like I was still a part of the church, and I was still doing stuff, like still kind of on the periphery, and occasionally I'd make it to church. And sort of over the next few years, like I would definitely go to church sometimes, and so I was still sort of a part of it. It wasn't really like I left the church. Does that make sense? I was still kind of there, and because my husband was still going as well, so we were still sort of part of that. But even since I've left, like properly, I mean, I didn't really ever leave officially. I haven't really ever said I don't go to church. In fact, I've actually told very few people that I no longer attend church.
What do you think would happen if you did?
I don't know. Yeah, of the few people that I've told, they've been fine. But then again, I've only really told specific people that I feel safe talking to that about. I don't want to be preached at, or I feel like I sort of really just wanted to completely remove myself from that, and try and work stuff out in my own life and in my own mind, because I also find it really difficult to articulate everything that I've sort of been through internally over the last few years. I find it like, if somebody asks me, like, why did you leave? And I say, well, I no longer believe in God. And then I find it really difficult to articulate why that's no longer a part of my life. Yeah. Yeah.
Does it ever take your breath away to think of the words you're saying? Like, I think if somebody could show me a video of myself now and could go back in time and show it to my 20-year-old self or whatever, and if I was to say something like, like what you said, God isn't real, Jesus is not the savior, because there is no such thing as, God or his son Jesus, or sin or heaven or hell. It's just all mythology. Certainly, we're an apostate, and we're certainly heretics. But what it comes down to use one word, is we're godless. We are. I'll do a little. Is it? I think this is it. No, I was going to do a plug for. This is Dan Barker's book, God, the Most Unpleasant Character in All Fiction. There's another book that someone wrote called Godless, and it's I don't see it. I may not have it, but somebody wrote a book called Godless, and but just to use that word, I'm godless. I'm absolutely godless. Does it ever take your breath away to think, wow, like, how did I get here? Not in the sense of like, I know how I got here, but just like the way that Christianity puts so many warnings, like, beware of the devil's going to get you, beware of the the deceivers, the false teachers, the itching ears. Does it ever, I mean, I guess to put it another way, do you ever wake up in the middle of the night thinking, what if I'm wrong? What if I'm on the path to hell? Does that ever get you anymore, or have you been able to recover from that?
I've mostly recovered from that. Very occasionally I'll get a thought like, what if I am, gonna go to hell? Or what if, I mean, I know that hell is not real. Like, I know all of this. But I think that I was so heavily brainwashed and indoctrinated that those thoughts still occur without me doing anything. Like they just sort of pop in every now and then. And it's just because of that whole brainwashing. But I'm able to fairly quickly be like, no, it's okay. Like, I'm okay. It's not real. We've moved on from this. Yeah. So yeah, definitely occasionally, but not like in a really, they don't make me question everything again kind of thing. It just sort of, they just pop in and then, yeah.
Yeah. In terms of if people did ask you, like, let's say someone came to you, a Christian, so why did you leave? And they were truly just almost doing it like as research. Like, look, I'm not going to evangelize to you. I'm not going to shame you. I'm not going to ask you to come back. I just want to know, your answers, and I'll let you have the final word. And then I'll just say, let's go have a coffee and talk about something else now. Just very respectful. If that could be the way someone would handle it, not in terms of the nitty gritty details, but just the overall big reasons. If someone said, I really want to know, not necessarily why you left the church, but why you don't believe in God anymore, what would you say would be the big topics that you would bring up with a person like that?
Yeah. So I would probably mention the whole, what I said before about the sin thing. Why are these things bad when actually they're not? They're just normal. They're just a part of life. And most Christian churches, I'm not saying all, because there are definitely some churches out there that are a lot more liberal and open-minded, and I think in a better place. But anyway, I'm just talking about your average church here. So what they believe just goes against like what is normal and like what is good, for lack of a better word. Yeah, so I would say that's part of it. And also another part of it, and a big part of it, is just how horrible the God of the Bible is, and how violent the Old Testament is, and how, let's just say that he's real for a minute, and that he did tell all the Israelites to go and kill and rape and destroy whole towns and villages, and just all of that stuff that's in the Bible. It's terrible. Like it is terrible. And if that God was real, I don't want to be any part of that. He's not real. And I've been sort of thinking about the motivation of the people that wrote a lot of the New Testament. Like, why did they write this stuff? Like, are they trying to make themselves look better for doing all these horrible things? Like by saying, God told me to do this awful thing, and I did it because I follow God and he is holy and righteous and all of that. And so, like, yeah, did they write those things to make themselves look better? I don't know. But like, yeah, I just have a whole lot of issue with how people are treated, how the people who aren't called God's people, how those people are treated. And then applying that today, how Christians view non-Christians. And again, I'm just talking about, just your average Christian, your average church, how they view other people as, they're living in sin. They're not living the way that God wants them to live. They're not saved. They're, like all of that. But then also, I guess, getting into some of the other issues in the world, like some of the more sort of political things, some of the, the abortion law. We've had that was reformed last year. Basically, it was just decriminalized. And I know that you've had that going on in Texas at the moment. I have a lot of things to say about that, but I won't get into it here. Things like that, things like the, gay marriage and equality, like just so many different things that I now have an opinion on that back when I was a believer, it was just, this is what God says and this is what the Bible says, so that's what I believe. And so, so the way that Christians treat non-believers and treat even just any of those issues, this is what the Bible believes, this is what God says, so this is how we are. We're just going to, our focus is like this. We're not going to consider that we can only see like our own lives in our own little corner of the world.
Yeah.
Whereas, take a step back and think about the people that are not in the same privileged position, as what you are. Take a step back and think about, all these people that just have completely different lives to you. Like they can't,
Traveling, I think, I mean, this is probably cliche, but just traveling the world helps open your eyes so much to see people doing different things, even to see other Christians in other parts of the world, but certainly to see other places where people aren't Christians. And I think that's some other people that I've interviewed have talked about how it struck them, like, you're going to go to different places where people completely have a different religion. And in your mind as a Christian, you have to say, you're bound for hell. I'm sorry to say it, if you're at the age of accountability, and especially if you've heard the gospel and rejected it. If you haven't heard the gospel yet, if it's not in your language, then there might be this quasi weird thing of, well, God's going to look at your heart because you don't have the gospel in your language yet. So he's going to look at your heart. But you're still you're dangling over the flames because you're worshiping some other God or your ancestors or something. And like so many people that, if we're either going to learn something from them, not in the sense of wanting to take their mythology, but just learn that people can be different and that's okay, or we're going to have to keep this condemnatory mindset. And it's very striking. And I think what gets me is it, for myself, and I know I represent some other people that would have agreed with this, that still was not enough, because we would always say, yeah, but at the end of the day, God's the judge, and we know, like, we know this much, and God knows, infinitely. We see this much, and God sees everything. We see just today in our lifetime. He sees eternity, and we do not see holiness the way He does. He's this white hot burning holiness, where He can't stand sin. He just incinerates sin if it gets near Him, and we're just drenched in sin, so to speak. We can't see reality, the real, and if we could see it, then we wouldn't say, oh God, you were wrong to do genocide, or God, you were wrong to do this. We would just be like, God, if we could truly see you, like Job says, God, I'm sorry I questioned you. I'm now going to put my hand over my mouth, repent in dust and ashes, and say, God, I'm sorry. It's time for me to be quiet and for you to speak. And that mentality was so thick for me. The big bang for my buck was the comparative mythology and the origins of Christianity, the origins of the New Testament. Did any of that come into your studies as you began to dig deeper? Like did it, I guess maybe put it a different way, did you begin to ask yourself at all, if I'm going to claim that I'm not sure I believe this anymore, then I'm curious, what is this actual, if it's potentially, if I'm shifting in my mind that this is just a man-made religion, then what is this, and where did it come from, and how did it evolve to what it is today? Like, did that become part of your story?
Not hugely.
Okay.
I think that I definitely questioned the origin of the Old Testament, and I think that a lot of the stories, that we now know as mythology, I definitely questioned that, but I didn't do a whole lot of research into it. And partially, well, I guess a lot of that is because at the time I was, starting a family and had, a lot of young kids, and sort of my focus, that's, I was focused on them. And and it's only been in the last sort of 6 months maybe that I've actually been researching like religious trauma and the effect that that's had on my life. So like, yes, I deconstructed, a little while ago, and it was, as I said, quite a long process, but it's only been sort of in the last little while that I've really been sort of looking into why I believed what I believed, and now why I believe what I believe now. Yeah.
In terms of the actual process, you said it was slow. How long ago would you have said this is definitely like either the watershed or the watershed is definitely past? How long ago did you actually fully kind of admit to yourself, I don't believe this is real anymore? And like whenever that hits you, what was that experience like of realizing I'm actually like, I'm a, whatever word you would use, I'm a pagan, I'm a non-believer, I'm an atheist, like, or what, how did that experience come about?
Yeah, so another thing that happened, and again, this is just such a minor thing, it's probably going to sound a little bit silly, but I think I was walking into our sitting room, our lounge area, and just a sudden thought occurred to me, like, I don't have to be the judge of other people, which sounds completely not even a thing, but to me that completely shifted my entire worldview, because before that point, like I said I was a Christian, not necessarily that I was judging people, but more that I was looking at certain aspects of people's lives and going, that's wrong, like they shouldn't be doing that, or that's not what I believe. They wouldn't call themselves a Christian. And it just occurred to me that I don't have to feel like that anymore. Like I don't actually have to look at other people in that way. And to me, that was just completely revolutionary and very freeing. And it was from that point. So that was probably my late 20s. And from that point, it sort of just snowballed. And it became like I sort of lost various beliefs, like the sort of the outlier beliefs, like, the end times and, like all of that, yeah. And sort of just sticking to the gospel, Jesus died to save me. And then eventually, it must have been really early 30s, like 30. I might have even had my third child by that point. I can't remember exactly. The timeline's a little fuzzy. Sorry. That I sort of really didn't want to go to church anymore. I remember it was over summer, and it might have even been just before I got pregnant with my third. And it was just so lovely. The weather was so lovely. And I just wanted to spend Sunday mornings outside doing something nice. And so I said to my husband, look, can we just maybe stop going to church some Sundays during summer to just enjoy the weather? Because at that time we had 2 little kids. We sort of, because they had to nap as well. So we had like a time in the morning where we could go and do stuff. And then they had sort of like a midday nap. And then we had time in the afternoon where we could go and do something else. And so we sort of felt like wanted to make the most of it during summer. And so we stopped going to church so much. And that was lovely. And we discovered that brunch could happen on a Sunday morning, and that was quite nice. And so that continued. And then I got pregnant with my third, and I had hyperemesis. So I threw up a lot. And that was probably one of the most horrible times in my life, but that's fine. And so I obviously didn't want to go anywhere or do anything. And so started like sort of going to church off and on, and then had our third baby, and I was exhausted from the pregnancy and looking after 2 other kids, and then got a newborn. And so again, kind of using my kids as an excuse not to go to church, but also at the same time kind of doing it for my own sanity and my own mental health and physical health as well at that point. Because the pregnancy was extremely difficult. It took me a very long time to recover from it physically. So I just sort of stopped going. And I remember the last time I went to church, I think my youngest was little, like maybe 3 or 4 months old. And I remember just sitting there. I might have even been in like the parents' back. She might have even been younger than that. Just in the back room where you feed your babies. Just thinking, I don't actually ever want to come to church again. At that point, I think I still believed in a God or in Jesus, but I was like, I'm done. I'm done with all of this. I've heard enough sermons in my life to last me several lifetimes, and I decided that I was done. And so from there, again, removing yourself a little bit further and a little bit further. And I hadn't been reading my Bible or anything for a good few years because I really just needed a break from that. And so just constant, because I'm constantly thinking about things. Like I'm quite sort of existential in how I think about things. And so it was constantly going on in the background of my mind, sort of thinking about, like the big questions, like what happens to us when we die, and if God is not real, then is there a God? Just all this stuff. And at the same time, I started listening to a podcast called The Liturgists. I don't know whether you've heard of them, but that was it's a group of people from various different walks of life. They'd all been Christians at one point and were on sort of various different spiritual journeys. And that's where I first heard of the phrase deconstruction. And so I started listening to them, and they just talked about various different topics, like, evolution might have been one of the topics. I was trying to think of another one. I can't think of them at the moment, but just various different topics that, would come up. And it was sort of almost like I was re-educating myself and retraining my brain how to think about things in the real world. And I found those podcasts just extremely helpful. And what was funny was my sister originally put me onto these because she was going through a deconstruction at a similar time. And at the time, neither of us really wanted to talk to the other person because we weren't sure whether the other person would be a bit judgmental or not understand, but we were kind of going through a similar thing. So once we finally did open up about that, it was really good because we were both like, oh, okay, we're going through this thing at the same time, and it was really helpful. And another one of my really good friends, another one of my really good friends was going through a similar thing, but she was a wee bit further ahead of me in terms of where she was at the time. And I just found talking to her it was such a relief to know that I wasn't in it alone, and that I wasn't going through this and thinking these thoughts alone, that somebody else was also going through the same thing and trying to get over the same difficulties and the same trauma as what I was. And so I found that really, really helpful.
It's a great point. So many of us feel like we're going through it alone, and it brings out the bravery that it takes to go through it, especially when you feel like you're alone. But it really helps when you have someone you can go to. And on that note, Recovering from Religion is a group. I'll have the link beneath our video. If anyone is going through it and feels like they don't have anyone to talk to, Recovering from Religion is available all over the world for people to talk to. And they won't even try to deconvert people. They just say, if you just need someone to talk to about this process, we're here to talk about it and help you not feel alone. But that's awesome that your sister was there. I've been kind of curious if I'll have anyone in my family go through it. I've got siblings that are very much involved in it, but I do still have a little bit of hope that at some point I'll hear some good news that someone's at least thinking through it. But I was curious specifically though, in zooming into the time when you deconverted. Was there a time when it hits you the idea of, I don't think there's an afterlife? And if that hits you that way, was that hard to take, hard pill to swallow?
No. So yes, there was definitely a time when it was suddenly very real that there wasn't an afterlife. And instead of being a hard pill to swallow. I think it was more freeing than anything else. I sort of felt like just another burden had been lifted, the many burdens that religion had put on me. I sort of felt free. Like I don't have to do all these things and be all these things to get to this certain place that, to be honest, didn't sound great anyway. And it also meant that I'm not going to eternal damnation, and that it actually made me realize how precious life is, and how our time on this earth is so just important and valuable, and all the things that we can sort of bring to our lives and input into our lives and those of the lives around us. And it just made me realize how precious life is, basically. It's
I want to cheer you on for saying that. Just I'm saying, absolutely, that's such a great point. I hope people heard that this when you realize this is reality, you don't suddenly, I mean, people sometimes get depressed realizing things that they were hoping would happen aren't going to happen. But it eventually, as you heal, and you mentioned the word trauma, but as you heal through it and you kind of reclaim your identity, you get to a point where you're like, I don't have an ancient book or some Canaanite demigod telling me what to think or what to be or how to do. Like I can create my own purpose. I can define who I'm going to be, how my, whatever time I've got, whether it's a lot of years or a few years, my years are going to be my years, not Yahweh's years, not the church's years, not the Bible's years. And just to the freedom and just the beauty of life, like, like the Dead Poet Society kind of mentality, like seize the day, wake up, be on fire, not on fire for the gospel or for some kingdom that's just make believe, fake believe, but it's like be on fire for yourself, be on fire for your loved ones, be on fire to leave this planet better than you found it. And I love it. I love it. So
no, absolutely. But I mean, along with that sort of that freedom, it also, I think you've talked about it before, but that real sense of peace. Like just this, like it's almost like this overwhelming, and it still hits me like almost every day, like just this sense of peace, and like, I don't have to live a certain way or be a certain way. It's really freeing. So that's probably, I would say, the biggest positive that's come out of my deconversion. It's just that freedom and peace, and the new appreciation for life. Because before, I don't know whether this is the same for everyone, but as a Christian, I was sort of fairly callous towards life. I sort of felt like, this life is temporary, and then I'm going to go to heaven and live forever, kind of thing. So, like, what does it matter if I don't, necessarily look after the planet, or not necessarily like look after the planet, but what does it matter? It's all going to burn one day. That sort of that mentality, which is so terrible. So I sort of feel like that's the main thing that I've gotten out of this.
That's awesome. Speaking of what you said, a few things that made me think of a question that we were writing about before, but I wanted to make sure I brought it up, and then I wanted to take us to the religious trauma topic as well. But before we get into the kind of the post deconversion, when you're looking now as a deconverted person at Christians, one of the questions that I think comes up for a lot of us is, why are Christians talking to unbelievers in the sense of like, when you know that you have to evangelize, and the most important topic is not how is your job going, how is your marriage going, how's your finances going, how's your health going. The only question that really matters, no matter what else is happening in your life, it matters, where are you with God? And so Christians kind of have to do this facade of sorts of let's talk about the sports game, let's talk about school, blah, blah, blah. Let's talk about anything. But it's when you look behind the curtain, they're weaseling their way in to get to one question. Can I tell you about the gospel?
Mm-hmm.
Do you struggle with like the motives of why Christians befriend non-Christians?
Yeah, well, I can really only speak to myself with this. I struggle with how I used to be in terms of my motives, I guess, with, being friends with people who weren't believers. Like, my motives weren't really to be friends with them, even though, like, I was, but my motives were that I wanted them to see how I was living and then maybe ask some questions about that, like, why are you so happy all the time? Why is your life so together? Why? And basically just show them through the way that I was living that there was like more to life than how they sort of saw things, which is like really terrible because it didn't have people's best interests at heart, and it wasn't the way that friendships should work, and so looking back, I'm a wee bit sort of ashamed, I guess, or a little bit like, ashamed of how I felt about interacting with people that didn't believe. Like, instead of just taking them as they were, at face value, accepting them for, who they were, instead it's kind of like this ulterior motive of, I'd like to be your friend so that maybe we can see some change, maybe the conversion, like that sort of, that sort of sneaky, not,
in the sense of the peace that we get, like you talked about, that peace kind of correlates to this area too, where you're saying
it's a massive part of it.
I'm free to just get to know somebody. Like, I can say, I just truly, I want to know how you're doing. I want to hear your story. I want to hear, what's your pain points are, how I can maybe bless you. But none of it is about, I have a worldview or belief that needs to kind of invade your situation in your heart. And if we don't really get to that kind of invasion phase, that's the whole point of it. So if we don't get there, I'm just going to pray that we can get there in the next conversation, for that to just be so gone and say, I'd love to get to know you, and I have nothing else as in my agenda. I just want to be your friend. It's such a cool thing. It's so freeing, so much peace.
And I think that is the biggest part of why I felt so at peace after realizing that I didn't have to try and convert people or talk to them about God, or it's so freeing. But like now, since moving away from that, and that was like my late 20s, I have met so many amazing people that I genuinely just want to be friends with, and so people that, when, I don't know whether you experienced this, but when I was a Christian, I would say, meet a non-Christian and be like, oh, they're so lovely, like, why aren't they a Christian, but they're so nice. And now I'm just discovering that people are just, not every person obviously, but people are just often nice. Like, there are a lot of good people out there, and just being able to meet so many people, like even like the mums at my kids' school, they're all so nice, and like, we help each other out, with looking after their kids or having play dates and transport and stuff, and it's just so nice. And then another group that I've become involved in is a book club, and so I started going to this book club probably, I want to say, about 6 years ago. And I was still kind of a Christian at that point. So it was just the journey of like my motivations for getting to know these people totally changing, and just realizing how valuable it is meeting new people and getting to know different people who have different ideas and different like life experiences than you, and how valuable that is, like, you know, learning from them. And yeah, like, just the girls in my book club are just so awesome. Like, they're just this really great group of women, and I love, you know, talking to them and hearing their stories and learning from them. And I mean, I've always been quite like a people person. I like, you know, meeting people and getting to know people. And now that I don't have like that whole Christian aspect there, it's such a fun experience, you know, like, you know, meeting people. And I mean, on the flip side of that, there has been the sort of the more trauma aspect of it, which we can get into soon, in terms of how to relate to other, like learning how to relate to other people without having that aspect there. So that was something that I had to sort of work through, and I'm still probably working through it. But anyway, going back to my original point, there is just a lot of good people out there, and I feel like I've been really lucky to have met just, yeah, so many great people, and it's really helped to change, you know, my worldview over the last few years. Yeah.
That's awesome. I was just thinking, kind of tongue in cheek, as a funny dynamic, but I think it's probably got some truth to it. That when you were a Christian, you find someone that's just so nice, but they're not a Christian yet, part of you is just like, I just, they're so close already. It's like they've already got the fruit of the Spirit, but they don't have the Spirit, but they're already so loving. I hope God saves them, and boy, I hope they don't have to burn. But then the person that's like cantankerous and bitter, and like they're just like, they're so ugly. You know, I think it's just our tendencies, like, well, they're kind of, they've already got half, you know, one foot in hell already at that point. So, you know, I hope they get out, but it's a shame. They're kind of obviously kind of cementing themselves into that. And just the whole dynamic, and two, just that message that's drilled into us, we talked about earlier, of like, if you can drum up in some way this passion to rescue people, even the cantankerous ones, like, do everything you can, save them as if from fire, like, get these people, pull them out, they're drowning, drowning from the, like the people in the Titanic, send everybody a life jacket that you can, because you have to try, and the freedom too to think, like you said, they're good people, but also that a lot of times we as Christians come to it like, I want to teach you, like, I've got something, I'm the one that's been in church, I've the one that's been in Sunday school, I've been reading this devotional, I have so much I can just like this reservoir of truth that I just want to kind of dispense to you. And to be able to say, you know what, number one, I was grossly deceived for decades, so I need to, number one, just start listening more. But even on an individual level, to look at someone and say, I truly just want, like, I want to be your friend, but I also want to learn, like, what do you know about life that I don't have? And I've got some people that I'm thinking of popping into my head right now, but I know this one gentleman, he is Hindu, and I haven't dove too deeply yet into what he believes, and I'm sure I will at some point, but he's become a very good friend of mine. And he is just one of these guys that I think you've got so much, not just that you're a nice guy, but you've got so much to teach, so many aspects of his personality that I think people would say, that's a gem, that's a cool guy that you want to be around him. Not just because he's like the life of the party, but because he exudes like like he's a wisdom that's beyond his age, well beyond his age. And you just love that. And you think, but he doesn't have Christ. And, before it would have been like, he needs to kind of put his worldly wisdom away and let me teach the true wisdom of God. But now it's like, you've got this freedom to just say, I can absorb now. I can stop being the teacher. I can be the student again, of life, of people, of cultures. And it's so beautiful. I know we've gone for a while. I do want to ask if we could to take a few minutes here at the end to take us into this topic we've touched on a few times, trauma, healing from religious trauma. A lot of it's related to reclaiming your identity. What did that look like for you? And if you could also, kind of shape your answers to that in terms of a little bit of advice, at the end of how do you help someone who is just going through it, especially if they're fresh, if they're kind of been out for a while, maybe they've picked up some resources, but it's someone that's just like, I just in the last 6 to 12 months, really dove deep, whether it's in the philosophical stuff, like you mentioned, homosexuality, or other issues of philosophy, like, why is God letting 3-year-olds die of cancer in the hospital? Or, why are kids dying of starvation? Endless kids have died of starvation while we've been speaking right now. Why is God doing that? Or even the, more religious stuff, like they've said, why does God need blood? Why can't God just forgive, as opposed to I need a sacrifice? Just say, I forgive you. You're in heaven. No problem. All these issues, or if they've been more the academic side, which I went down with, the looking at where did the Bible get copied, what stories were related to it with comparative mythology, the mystery cults, and all that stuff. Whatever path they took, it's hit them like, this isn't real. Jesus is not. This is not reality. Christianity, of any vein of Christianity, is a cult, and they're now, out, or mostly out, but they're kind of shaken, because this is like, number one, it's they're realizing the ramifications of the afterlife. For some people like myself, that was very difficult to take. It still is. It still kind of still smarts a little bit. For other people, it's realizing people are going to shun them if they speak up. They're going to get a tsunami of backlash. And for other people, it's just they're fine. Otherwise, they just feel like, well, what do I do with my life now? My life was all about this, and now that's gone. So what's left? Like, do I just sit around and die? Like, there's so many questions, and the lack of, reframing your passion for life. People are really lost in some of these situations. They feel so alone, and they're very brave, obviously, to go through this, but they feel like they're so weak at the same time. And so it just feels dark, and they're obviously we all do the second guessing, like, what if the reason that I'm feeling so weak and confused is because I'm fighting the truth, which is God, which is the gospel, which is the Bible. Maybe I'm struggling because I'm not bowing my knee to Christ. All these questions come up, and people are just getting to a point where, like, I don't know where to start. I feel so confused. I feel so powerless, and so many levels of that. Whatever that looked like for you, could you just kind of take us, into some of the details, and then maybe wrap our time up with some suggestions? Obviously, neither one of us are professionals. Some people will need a counselor, but just in terms of casual advice for people, what would you say to people who are going through some of these harder parts of this journey?
Yeah, well, I think for me, finding a couple of other people that were going through a similar thing was really helpful, or even finding people that have been through it. Like your YouTube channel, I feel like is extremely helpful, because people can listen to other people's stories, and you might relate to, say, like one person or an aspect of one person's story, and then another aspect of another person's story. And I feel like that is hugely valuable, because hearing from other people and hearing other people's stories helps you feel normal, and it also helps to put into words what you're feeling, because a part of what made it a wee bit difficult for me was just not being able to put into words what I was going through and what I was feeling, and what I sort of now believe, and the whole process of deconstruction. And so by listening to the podcast that I was listening to, it helped to actually not only to put into words what I was going through, but also to reframe certain things, certain topics, to sort of undo some of the brainwashing that had been done. Because, like, not only are you trying to, your worldview is completely shifted, and you realize that something you believed in for so long is completely rubbish. You're not only dealing with that, you're also dealing with the brainwashing that's happened and the trauma that's happened as a result. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of Christians will say that they were not brainwashed and that they have no trauma associated with that. And perhaps they don't feel that, where they are in their lives, they don't feel that. and that's fine. But I feel like for a lot of people that are coming out of it and having to reshape their worldview is quite daunting. Just an example of trauma that you don't realize is there. When I must have been about 12, ish. My school went to not my school, sorry, my class went on like a wee mini camp situation. We went camping. I think we stayed in a house. We stayed in a little village called Akaroa, which is just sort of part of Banks Peninsula, which is where we are. And it's a beautiful wee town. And so we went there for a wee camp. And part of that was that we went to a church on Sunday morning. And this was a little, quaint little Anglican church, stones and, built with stone. And it was a really lovely little church. And it had like the traditional like wooden pews and little hymn books. And for some unknown reason, this triggered a weird, I know now that it was like a sort of PTSD situation, like a trauma situation. It just reminded me of the cult that I was in, as a child. And it just brought up all these memories of being like in this horrid, dark Sunday school room, because it was, it was in this awful little room and down a corridor, and just that it was the same sort of feeling. It's really hard to describe because it shouldn't have created such a weird response, but it did. And I remember getting a wee bit upset and sort of trying to like talk to my friends about it, most of whom had been in the same situation as children, the same little Sunday school room, and they were totally fine. And they basically told me to get over it because I was being stupid, and everything was fine. And the other thing, I didn't like the hymns because they were singing hymns, and when we were in the cult, that's all they sang was these really old hymns, and I hated that. And it made me feel really like unsafe and just very like uncomfortable. And it's like, looking back, it's so weird because I can't recall anything ever really bad happening, but it did create this weird response.
Well, I think what it does is that, I mean, if I could interject, because I would totally agree. I think what it does is it gives you the eerie sense that your ability to detect reality could be so, as you mentioned, the brainwashing, the psychological manipulation, the way that you're basically shielded from reality. It feels like it's a version of a mental prison camp where you're utterly restricted. The list of where you can go is you can go here, you can go there at this time, you can talk to those people, but it's like a mental prison. And for people to say, you shouldn't feel like it's a big deal. I mean, any mental prison of any kind, whether it's a church or a relationship, any mental prison is like, that's one of the biggest. I mean, I remember as Christians, even the pastors would say, your biggest battles are going to be in your mind as a Christian. Well, that transcends Christianity. The biggest battles probably are in our minds and in terms of our human experience. And if you are recognizing that there is a prison for your mind, and you can literally, like, it's not just like a feeling, but you can like look at a room or look at a book or hear a hymn and think that is part and parcel and woven into the fabric of a prison for your mind. That should trigger you like crazy, because that is dangerous stuff. And we know that there are people who are getting born into it today who are never gonna, like, they're gonna be in that prison from today, their day of birth, through the day that they die. And that frightens us for them, and it frightens us that we could have still been in it.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, everything you were just saying there does make quite a lot of sense. It's that feeling like trapped, I think, was more the like trapped in this system of beliefs. And I think maybe it just affected me more than it did my friends. I don't know. but yeah, that definitely rings true. Yeah.
Like a labyrinth.
Because it always, it always was sort of a bit confusing to me why I reacted that way. And then, my friends were okay with it. But it's one of those things. But
sometimes, so I wonder if some of those people might do a little digging later and find out that there's more to it. Like, because we all heal in different ways, and we all have to peel back the layers of the onion in our own time.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I guess so. Moving on from that, like other trauma responses. I think one of the things specific to me, I can't speak for other people, but is that Bible verse that talks about like I must decrease so that you might increase, or something like that. Do you know what I'm talking about? I don't know where it is.
John the Baptist, he must increase, I must decrease and he must increase. Yeah.
That's it. Yeah.
The baton on of the kind of the Old Testament to the New Testament. I think it was kind of like the representing the old covenant, the old way of doing things. But for sure.
Yeah. Well, I took that totally literally. And so like tried to sort of, I don't know whether you had this similar experience, but you try and sort of decrease who you are as a person and sort of minimize, I guess, who you are as a person so that God can sort of increase in your life. But in doing that, you kind of take away part of who you are as a person. And so I found it quite difficult to try and like relearn who I am without that God aspect and without that sort of spiritual aspect. And I think, but for me, part of that is just really not being in touch with my emotions or feelings or anything like that, which sounds bizarre, but I'll try and give you a couple of examples. Like I'm not a very emotional person, and maybe I never was a very emotional person, but I felt like in order to be like a successful Christian and show people how I was living for God, that like I really had to suppress emotions, and that I had to react to things in a particular way in order to,
more like a stoic version of stoic Christianity.
Absolutely. But of course that that sort of trickled down into other areas of my life. And so just some examples of this. Like I don't cry very often, and I'm talking about like hardly ever. Like I the last time I cried was probably over a year ago, maybe, and it's because we had to tell my daughter that her bunny had died. And I was really like, I didn't want to tell her because I knew that she'd be really upset, and so I got upset because she was going to be really upset. So that's sort of the level of and then another aspect of this is that I find it really I can get upset on other people's behalf. I can get upset at other people's stories and how other people feel about things. I can really, feel that, but I find for myself, I don't really feel that. And from the research that I've done, I'm pretty sure that it's just a trauma response, essentially, because like you've repressed stuff for so long that it just sort of become not even repressed, but just changed who you are, I guess, changed the way you react to things. That's more it. The way you react to things to fit a certain mold and be a certain way, that it just and another example of this was a few years ago. I think it was maybe 2016. I had a miscarriage in between my son and my youngest daughter. And I'd gotten quite far along. I think I was 12-ish weeks, and everything had so far been fine. And then, went to the scan and found out, no, it's actually, it stopped growing 5 or 6 weeks ago. And just not really having a response for myself. I remember getting upset at one point because we had to then tell, specifically, it was because we had to tell my dad and my stepmom, who were on holiday, not just them, but also, you know, like my mum and some other family members, that we're told, because we were almost through the first trimester. They called it a miscarriage, but anyway. And so like I had to tell them that, you know, there wasn't going to be a baby, and like just that awful feeling of like not wanting to disappoint them, and just feeling like so upset because like we had to like tell them and disappoint them, and I just felt sad because they were going to feel sad, if that makes sense. But I didn't really feel like upset for myself, if that makes sense. And like I had to go and have, you know, the procedure done to, you know, sort everything out because my body wasn't going to take care of it. And I just remember feeling really impatient because I wanted to have it done like immediately, but I had to wait at some weird thing in the Christchurch hospital where they won't do it for a week or so. But anyway, beside the point. So yeah, having that, going in, and you have to talk to like one of the really lovely gynecologist nurses on the gynecologist ward. And so we were talking to this woman, and she was telling us about any, you know, like grief programs, grief counselling that you have access to. And she handed me a little grief pack, which was lovely. And then she said, you know, I know how you feel. I had a miscarriage. And at that point, I started to tear up because I was like, well, I'm getting upset for you because you had this awful thing happen to you, but I can't feel that for myself. And so I think that that sort of, yeah, that's just a couple of examples of that. And I probably need to go to therapy or something. I don't know.
It's a good example of how this worldview shapes you in ways that you can't see. I mean, it's just shaped you so much. And I think even questions relating to sexuality, certainly it's a big one. I'm starting to get some notes together for some topics. I'm going to deal with that more in the future. But you know, people dealing with feeling like, just one quick example, you know, feeling so much shame. Like you can't have shame over sexuality for decades, and then suddenly it's just undone. Even if you mentally know that's not real, there's no God watching me, there's no God in my mind to see what I'm thinking, and there's no, you know, modesty is a purely, it's just a construct. There's no modesty. Showing more skin or less skin is irrelevant. You know, we all used to be swinging from the trees. We all used to show everything, and it's just, but to realize this stuff has had like roots of a tree that have just dug deep into you, and you can chop off the top of it, but there's roots there. And if you really want to do the hard work, there's roots that some of us may never realize how this has shaped us. And the idea that if this weren't there, what would we have been like? And I will just add this, it inspires me to think about the next generation. Like, okay, if we want to guess, what would it be like without that? What will we have been like? Well, we can't necessarily see it in ourselves. It might be kind of too late in a sense, not to be pessimistic, but some of the things you just can't undo it. But to think, well, the next generation can have it removed, you know, they can like never have it. So if we do a good job in other areas of life, meaning love them so much and take good care of them and train them well in other areas, you know, give them science and all that, give them a good mind and a good education, that maybe without the whole shame culture and all this other stuff, maybe we'll actually get to see a little bit, you know, before we pass, what it would have been like to be like that, and to see what that worldview is like. It excites me to think about.
Absolutely. And I mean, I think that that's actually also a big part of why I was questioning stuff, is because I don't want my kids to believe that they're bad. I don't want them to believe that they were born into this sinful nature and that they are just inherently bad and that they need to get right with God to, you know, get to heaven or whatever. Like I don't want that for my kids. And I don't want them to read the Bible and learn about how God ordered, you know, the massacre of all these people. You know, I don't want them exposed to that, and I don't want them brainwashed. I don't want them I don't want them to have to go through all of that stuff that we went through as kids, and you know, young adults and then adults, and to have those issues in their lives. And so I think that one of the reasons that I was looking into spiritual trauma and the things that it can be responsible for, especially in my life, and being aware of the fact that my emotional intelligence isn't great for myself. I don't want to put that on my kids, and I want to learn how to try and teach them, or at least encourage that emotional intelligence, as well as all the other stuff, teaching them about evolution and you know, where we all came from, and just creating just a more healthy thought culture for them, that they don't have to be scared that they're going to spend eternity in hell, and they don't have to be scared of demons or, you know, anything that we were sort of brought up with. And so, I mean, that's been a massive driving force for me, is to make it better for my kids. And I'm sure you have a similar sort of experience there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And just in a word, to create a context where they can hopefully thrive. Just thrive is much more than people with all these roots to, you know, I mean, and part of it is I definitely don't want to also discourage people who have, you know, some of these roots to work through, like I'm sure both of us do. But, you know, these things shaped us. You know, they are our story, and we obviously can't. There's no time machine, no TARDIS. We can't undo these things. They shaped us. They brought us to where we were, and you know, some, you know, without these scars, we don't know who we'd be. But they shaped us for what it is. You know, it's the way the cards fell, the way the dice rolled, and it's really cool though to see people like yourself saying, you know, yeah, this is how it happened, but from this point on, I'm going to take responsibility. Like I'm not a victim of all this stuff. I do have to heal from some of it, but from this point on, you know, we're responsible people who are taking the best that we can, best energy and focus and passion we can, to truly seize the day for ourselves, for our loved ones, for the next generation. And that's so precious. And hopefully again, our kids can just thrive so much more as a result of it. It's kind of like when you think about it collectively, like in terms of humanity, and you see all these research reports saying more and more people are leaving the church. There's more atheists than ever, and you see the numbers increasing, and you kind of hope and think, well, maybe this is the beginning of the end of some of the mythology in our world. And you know, I'm just making stuff up here, but let's say that, you know, by the year, if we don't blow ourselves up or get destroyed by an asteroid, you know, maybe by the year 3000, you know, Christianity is just like the fringest of the fringest of the fringes, like, you know, 0.0001% is a Christian. Almost nobody, and you know, it's gone the way of Zeus and Ra and Thor and all that, as it should. And just to think, if that's where it's going in the future, and maybe this you know, the next couple hundred years, and maybe even these 100 years that we're like from here to the next 100 years, are so pivotal for our culture, our world, to shift toward that kind of world where we're all done with mythology as a worldview. To think that we are planting some of the biggest, most important seeds ever. Like what we do is like the really well-oiled hinge of a big door, and we are putting grease in it, and that door is going to slide so far because of what we did, you know, with our time. And it's like, it's a big responsibility. It's a big privilege. It really is.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that definitely starts with us who have, you know, removed ourselves from religion, changing it, you know, for the next generation, so they don't have to, you know, deal with that. And just to briefly touch on it, also the whole sexuality aspect of it, because we haven't really talked too much about that, but just not wanting to put that shame on my kids as they're growing up, like actually wanting to give them some really good information around sexuality and teach them to be open-minded as well, because that's not something that was ever acceptable or even talked about, when I was growing up. But yeah, teaching them to be open-minded and to respect people that are different from you. I mean, this is going into the broader, but like, teaching kids that there are so many different worldviews out there, and just teaching them to be respectful of people that don't share the same beliefs and the same, just thinking the same way that they do. I think that is hugely important.
Yeah. And even for themselves too, just to be able to look at sexuality and pleasure and even eroticism and just be able to say, there's absolutely like zero shame that you should feel in this. You should be able to dive in and totally enjoy this part of life. So having
been given all the information that they need, like, I don't understand sometimes like what churches think, like whether they just don't talk about it and they don't give the right information, that kids will just not be interested. Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's like they're handing someone a stick of dynamite and saying good luck with it.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, I did want to ask if you could to take us to the finish line with any final advice you would give to someone who's at that starting point and just saying, I'm definitely more confused and grounded right now. How would you advise them to get started? Or to just how to be feel a little bit safer in their own skin through the journey of deconstruction?
Well, I've talked about having people that you can talk to, like find someone. There has to be someone, even if it's online, that that you can talk to. I think that's really important. Listen to podcasts, watch your YouTube channel, hear other people's stories, but also like don't stop like asking yourself the hard questions. Like don't stop asking the questions, because it's worth it. Like even if it feels horrible and it's difficult at the time, it is ultimately worth it.
And I would just piggyback on that to say to those who are going through it to realize it, if you're going through it and you're struggling, it really does get better. I mean, I've interviewed a lot of people, got a lot of interviews up on the channel, a lot more that I need to post when I've got hopefully time. But person after person after person that said it was dark for a while, or it was confusing, it was rough. People, every single person said it got better, and eventually it got much better. And just to feel like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And I would just maybe add from my personal side of it, this is not probably important for everybody, but for those who are kind of like my personality, start to get really, really educated in what this Christianity was. And what I mean by that is the idea of Stockholm syndrome, the idea that you loved your captor. When you escape, you have to kind of do some digging and say, I mean, we're all going to beat ourselves up a little bit, like, what was I thinking? Oh my goodness, this was so obvious. But get past the beating yourself up and get past the angry atheist phase where you're just like, I'm so angry at my church for not telling me the truth. This is garbage. Get past anger at yourself, get past anger at your, pastor, whatever, your parents. Get to a point where you're not angry at the situation, but just ask yourself the question at that point, what was this? Like, what was I in? What happened? And I think one of the best things for me was to truly, again, I know it's not for everybody, to truly dive into the origins of Christianity. And I wanted to just recommend a couple channels for that anyone that doesn't know what I'm talking about. You're like, where do I even start? There's a channel that's a good friend of mine, Derek Lambert. He has a channel called Myth Vision. If anyone hasn't gone to Myth Vision, He interviews people and talks to people all the time about just the mythology behind Christianity, how the books of the New Testament and Old, how they got put together, other books that weren't in the canon that could have been, church history, how it evolved, and how they made different church council decisions as to what Christianity should look like and who were the main power players in that. Things like that. So Myth Vision is a great one. Another one is Dragons in Genesis on YouTube. Jason Folks does a great job. And for anyone that's more of a reader, there's a blog called Vridar, Vridar, the Vridar blog. Great guy in Australia named Neil, not too far from you, relatively speaking. But Neil Godfrey does a fantastic job. Just he goes to all these books that talk about where the mythology of Christianity came from, and he just writes blog articles about all these topics. And for some people, that kind of information that I'm talking about is pure gold. It's just like, now I know where it came from. And you can start to drop if you like had this fear of like, maybe hell's real. Well, when you begin to realize they're copying from, they literally have the words Tartarus and Hades. Those are straight out of Greek mythology. You start to realize that they're quoting from the book of Enoch and all this stuff. All the doubts of maybe I was wrong, maybe I should look at God again. You become so crystal clear that this is truly mythology, that there is literally no way for you to, like, you can't undo that. You can't unsee what you've seen at that point.
Yeah.
You have thoroughly deconverted. And if someone were to say to you, no, but Jesus, be like, let's open our scripture then and let's read about Jesus. And you'll read it and you'll be like, that's a copy of Dionysius. That's a copy of Pythagoras. That's a copy of this. And you're like, I can't read the Jesus stories anymore without identifying all the other places that they copied his story from. Once you get to that point, the Christians have their power is their final straw of power is gone, because to you truly can see through it all. It's like the Matrix, have you ever seen the Matrix where Neo at the end, he's shot, for the first one, the first video, where he's shot, in the chest, where he's trying to get to the phone. The agent gets there first. Neo opens the door and bam, 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 he's shot over and over and over. But when Neo, resurrects or whatever, gets back up, he looks at the hallway. It's not the hallway and the agents anymore. It's the computer code. And it's like, once you see that, game's over. Game is fully
you can't
over.
unsee it. Yeah.
Well, I know I've kept you for a while. I've asked you a lot of questions. Is there anything else you wanted to add to your story, or anything else you wanted to talk about?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. I hope people find this sort of a little bit interesting and hopefully a little bit helpful, because as I mentioned earlier, I just think that hearing other people's stories is just so valuable in terms of helping you just articulate and voice your own story. So thank you for asking some really good questions.
Yeah, it was well said. There is so much power in stories. It's amazing. And I think with all the information that we have, that we could investigate this and research that, and a lot of times what we just really need to get back to is the human journey, and sometimes it's hearing someone else's journey, especially the people that resonate with us. We're like, that person's kind of like me or went through something similar. It really does. It goes down deep, and the Bible's full of stories, and those stories impacted us. But to get past the mythological stories to people's actual journeys, there's so much power there. And I wanted to just say too, thank you for being willing to do this today, because I know it's a brave thing to go through it in the first place, but it's a brave thing to share it, because like you said, some people don't always know. We know some people might respond poorly because they're just not ready for it. And some people just aren't ready to escape the matrix, to be unplugged.
Absolutely.
Or to find out even that you got unplugged. It's a very jarring thing. And so just thank you for doing it. And I just want to encourage you too. I've got a feeling that as we look back on the interview later, that there'll be a lot more topics that we could have uncovered. So number one, I want to ask if you do have a bunch of topics that come to mind, write them down and we'll do a follow-up sometime. But then also, just wanted to say in terms of, for you impress me as someone that needs to start a platform. And
Okay.
God's telling me,
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you have a word.
I've got a word for you. No, but I think you've got, I think your voice in this could actually go really far. I think you're one of the people that strikes me a lot as someone that could actually be one of the main players in some of these conversations. So I just want to encourage you in that. If you ever feel like that's something that you'd be interested in, I would absolutely support you in it. If you ever do want to create a platform, because people, I think people really, really, really need to see someone that's gone through all the stages and is now really, really grounded. Just, someone that's going to really help them be an example that they can follow in your footsteps. So I appreciate you doing this. And again, as we've been speaking with Anna Schroeder, am I pronouncing that correctly? Schroeder. Oh, I was so close. Anna Schroeder, thank you so much for doing this. Really appreciate your time. Thank you again for sharing your story. It's awesome. And I do look forward to doing it again.
Okay, well, thank you.
Thanks so much.